About 6 years ago, I was working as a land surveyor for a small firm in rural Maine. I had just relocated from Boston, hoping for a change of scenery and the chance to save up. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid well, and I enjoyed spending a lot of time outdoors. One of my assignments involved mapping a large plot of privately owned forest, about 30 miles outside of Bangor. The owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Caldwell, was considering selling part of the land for development and needed an updated survey. The forest was old and dense, mostly made up of pine and birch with some maple trees scattered throughout. Mrs. Caldwell's family had owned it for generations, and from what I understood, it had never been logged or developed significantly. My partner for this job was a local man named Pete. He was in his 50s, born and raised in the area, and knew these woods like the back of his hand. At least that's what he said. We had been working on the survey for about a week, moving methodically through the property, taking measurements and marking boundaries. The work was repetitive, but I didn't mind the peace and fresh air. One day, we were working in a particularly dense part of the forest, where the undergrowth was thick and made it hard to move. The trees were so close together that they blocked much of the sunlight. Pete, usually unshakable, kept glancing around nervously. This was unusual for him. He had always been unfazed, even when we encountered bears or other wildlife. When I asked what was wrong, he shook his head, muttering something about the place giving him the creeps. By mid-afternoon, we reached a small clearing. In the center stood a massive ancient pine tree, easily the largest I had seen on the property. Its trunk was twisted and gnarled, and the bark looked almost black in the dim light. As we approached to take measurements, I noticed something odd. The ground around the base of the tree was completely bare. No grass, moss, or undergrowth within a 10-foot radius. It was as if nothing could or would grow there. Pete saw it too and stopped dead in his tracks. "We shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low. I could tell he was spooked. I was about to ask him what he meant when I saw it. A strange symbol carved into the trunk of the tree. It looked as old as the tree itself. The edges were smooth, worn by time, but it was still clearly visible. The symbol was unlike anything I had ever seen. It seemed to shift and change as I looked at it, never quite the same shape twice. Staring at it for too long gave me a headache, and my vision began to blur. Then we heard it, a low, rhythmic humming sound coming from all around us. It started quietly but grew louder until it was all I could hear. The air around us seemed to vibrate, and that's when things got really strange. The clearing itself began to warp. It's hard to describe, but it felt like reality was bending. The trees seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them, and the ground beneath us felt unstable, like it might collapse at any moment. I glanced at Pete. Fear was written all over his face. Without a word, we both turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, desperate to get away from the tree and the clearing. We ran until our lungs burned, and our legs felt like jelly. When we finally stopped to catch our breath, we found ourselves on the edge of the property, near where we had parked the truck. Pete was pale and trembling. Between ragged breaths, he told me there were stories passed down by the locals about that part of the woods. Tales of missing people, strange lights, and time behaving oddly for those who ventured too deep. We decided to call it a day and headed back into town. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that symbol carved into the tree, and I swear I could still feel the strange humming in my bones. The next morning, Pete called in sick. I didn't blame him. I felt rattled myself. But we had a job to finish, so I went back alone. I made sure to avoid the area we'd seen the tree, but as I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. All I could hear was the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. I tried to focus on the surveying, but my mind kept drifting back to the strange symbol and the bizarre events of the day before. It was around midday when I heard it. A soft, melodic whistling sound carried on the wind. The tune was hauntingly beautiful, unlike anything I had ever heard. I felt an irresistible pull toward the sound, almost as if it were calling to me. I moved deeper into the woods, following the music, and before I knew it, I realized I had no idea where I was. The trees all looked the same, and I couldn't remember which direction I had come from. Panic began to set in as I spun around, trying to figure out where I was. Then I saw her about 50 yards away, a woman with long black hair, flowing in a wind that wasn't there. She was dressed in what seemed to be traditional Native American clothing, but I couldn't tell from which tribe. The clothing had intricate beadwork that shimmered as I watched. Her skin was an unnatural pale green, and her eyes were completely black, like pools of ink. Anyone could tell this wasn't a normal person, but I knew more. My grandfather, who had some Penobscot heritage, used to tell stories about forest spirits and supernatural beings from Native American folklore. The woman before me fit one of his stories, the tale of the forest wife. Though to be honest, it was a story I hadn't heard anywhere else. Maybe my grandfather had misinterpreted it. I don't know, but the forest wife was said to be a malevolent spirit, capable of luring men to their doom in the deepest parts of the woods. The spirit smiled at me, revealing teeth that were too sharp to be human. She then beckoned me with a finger, still whistling that haunting melody. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but my body didn't obey. I took a step toward her, though I didn't want to. I tried to speak, to yell, but no sound came out. Just as I was about to take another step, a piercing screech shattered the silence. A massive owl swooped down from a nearby tree, flying directly at the spirit. She hissed a sound so sharp that I had to close my eyes. When I opened them again, she and the owl were gone. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the branches that whipped my face and arms. When I finally stopped, gasping for breath, I found myself back at the edge of the property. I didn't hesitate. I threw my gear in the truck and sped out of there. I didn't stop until I was back in town. That whole drive, I couldn't stop thinking about the fact that I was a surveyor and my job would take me back into those woods. I became more and more paranoid. So, when I stopped my truck, I called my boss and told him I couldn't go back into those woods. He didn't seem surprised. He said it wasn't for everyone and chuckled. Not long after that, I quit that job entirely. Later, I did some research into Native American folklore. There are tales of spirits that guard places and forests. Some are protectors, some are tricksters, and some are evil. To this day, I don't know if I experienced a hallucination or if I really encountered the forest wife. Could have been some kind of spirit. What I do know is that Mrs. Caldwell eventually donated the entire property to a local Native American tribe, with the condition that it would never be developed. Sometimes I wonder if she knew about the spirits in those woods. Maybe that's why she was so reluctant to sell it in the first place. I've never gone back to Maine. Once I crossed that border, I didn't look back. Some places leave a mark on you, and I've decided to move on. If I ever see another symbol carved into a tree, I don't think I'll be able to handle it. I never expected to be sharing this, but here it is. It happened around 8 years ago when my life was in a tough spot. I just lost my job at a tech startup in Portland, and my longtime girlfriend and I had broken up. I felt lost with no real direction. Then my friend Jake suggested I join him on a backpacking trip to Mount Rainier National Park to clear my head. He'd been talking about this hidden trail he'd found, one that led to some beautiful alpine lakes. Though I wasn't much of an outdoors person, I thought it might help me break out of my rut. Jake ended up backing out last minute due to a family emergency, but I decided to go by myself anyway. Looking back, that was probably a bad call. I wasn't ready for a solo backpacking trip, but I was too stubborn and desperate for a change to turn back. I drove out to the park early one crisp morning in October, feeling both excited and anxious. The drive was stunning, winding through lush forests and along a scenic coast. By early afternoon, I reached the trailhead, a small gravel lot at the end of a rough forest road. The trail was easy to follow at first, a well-kept path winding through ancient forests of cedar, hemlock, and Douglas fir trees that had been there for centuries. Their branches formed a thick canopy above, letting the sunlight break through in spots as I hiked deeper into the woods. But by the late afternoon, the trail started to get rougher and harder to follow. It turned into little more than a faint game trail tangled with ferns and fallen logs. I pulled out my map and compass, trying to figure out where I was, but the thick trees blocked out most of the sky. I should have turned back, but I didn't want to admit defeat. I kept going, determined to find those lakes Jake had mentioned. As the light started to fade, I reluctantly decided to make camp for the night. I'd figure out where I was in the morning. I found a small clearing and set up my tent, gathering firewood before it got dark. As night fell, the forest around me came alive with sounds. Owls hooting, small animals rustling in the underbrush, and the wind whispering through the trees. I managed to start a small fire and heated up some freeze-dried food, trying to ignore the unease settling in my stomach. The first night was quiet enough, though I didn't sleep well. The sounds of the wilderness were unsettling to me. I woke up with the first light, packed up my camp, and set off again. My goal was either to find the lakes or retrace my steps back to the trailhead. But as the day wore on, I began to feel more and more certain that I was hopelessly lost. The forest was getting denser, the terrain more rugged, and I thought I was seeing things out of the corner of my eye. Every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. By late afternoon, exhaustion and hunger were starting to hit me hard, and I decided to make camp early to regroup. I found a spot near a small stream and got to work setting up my tent and gathering firewood again. That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl. I froze, my heart racing. I scanned the area around me, trying to see what it was. For a moment, I thought I saw a dark shape moving between two huge tree trunks, maybe 50 yards away. It was bigger than a man, but moved unnaturally, like it wasn't quite human. But when I blinked, it was gone. Terrified, I finished setting up camp as quickly as I could, my hands shaking as I tried to light the fire. Once night came, the forest grew unnervingly quiet. The usual sounds, frogs, insects, and owls were all absent. I huddled by the fire, flinching at every snapping twig or rustling leaf. A few times, I heard that same growl, sometimes seeming to come from just behind me, sometimes from far off in the distance. At one point, I saw something in the woods, two huge eyes reflecting the firelight. They were set high off the ground, taller than me, and attached to a shaggy, fur-covered figure. Its limbs were wrong, its arms were too long for its body. I must have made some noise because suddenly, the eyes blinked out, and I heard something large crashing through the underbrush. I spent the rest of the night in my tent, too terrified to sleep. When dawn finally broke, I packed up and hurried off in what I hoped was the right direction. I felt like I was being watched the whole time, and I began to smell a musky, animal odor. Then, I found a massive footprint in the mud, at least 18 inches long with strange, elongated toes. I kept walking for hours, panic setting in as I realized I had no idea where I was. The trees seemed to be closing in on me, blocking out the sky. That's when I heard voices, human voices. I ran toward them like a man possessed, exhaustion forgotten. I burst out of the trees onto a well-maintained trail and almost ran into a family of hikers. I must have looked like a madman, dirty, wild-eyed, babbling about monsters in the woods. The father of the family, a calm man named Greg, helped me relax. They gave me some water and trail mix, and Greg pulled out a map to show me where I had gone wrong. Somehow, I'd wandered 15 miles off course, ending up in a completely different part of the park. Greg and his family walked me back to the nearest ranger station, where I was able to catch a ride back to my car. I've spent a lot of time trying to make sense of what happened. Maybe I was hallucinating from exhaustion and dehydration. Maybe there was an animal that I misidentified in the dark. But believe it or not, I still enjoy hiking and camping now, as long as I stick to well-traveled trails and never go alone. It's something I've learned to love, but I always make sure to be out of the woods before nightfall. I know firsthand that when darkness falls deep in the wilderness, sometimes it brings visitors that are better left undisturbed. It was the winter of 2002 in a remote area of Southern Virginia, around 1 a.m. You could only see a few scattered houses every couple of miles, with nothing but trees and fields in between. The only light came from a dim full moon peeking through some clouds and bare branches. The weather had been unseasonably warm earlier in the day, creating a perfect setting for fog to roll in that night. That day had been exhausting. I was a senior in high school, dealing with the usual pressures of school life. On top of that, I was on the school basketball team, which was why I was driving back so late, far away from the town. We'd lost another away game, but everyone was in high spirits, looking forward to the upcoming Christmas break. We always made the most of our rides home from games, no matter the outcome. The drive itself was fine. It was late, sure, but smooth. There's always talk of deer darting in front of cars on country roads during late-night drives in the fall and winter. It had happened to me a year before, so I was always careful and kept my eyes on the sides of the road, even if I wasn't driving. I'd said my goodbyes to the team and was heading back home. The roads around here were long and narrow, stretching for miles without much else. As I drove, I saw it. Though it's been over 20 years, I can still recall every detail of that moment. Even today, when I returned to visit my parents, I checked that same spot. I was about halfway home, listening to music on the radio, probably something like Creed or a band from that era. What I do remember clearly is the cold wind whipping through my hair as I drove down that dark, two-lane road. I enjoyed having the windows down and the air conditioning running late at night in winter. Kept me alert after such a tiring day. I wasn't speeding, just driving at around 40 miles per hour, enough to keep the cold air in my face. The fog was thickening, so I slowed down, as the road was narrow with no shoulders or streetlights. The fog made it harder to see anything that might cross the road, especially on this stretch where a creek ran beneath the road through a culvert. Suddenly, I felt something wasn't quite right, like something was about to happen. So I slowed even more, rolling up my window as I squinted into the fog. Then, I slammed on the brakes, nearly stalling my car. I saw a blur on the right side of the road. Something was running straight towards me. It was a large, black shape, a wolf of sorts, moving quickly through the fog that was now denser than ever. To my surprise, it was far bigger than any wolf I'd ever seen. Virginia is home to some large predators, black bears, alligators, coyotes, but this was no ordinary wolf. I've seen wolves around here bigger than coyotes and dogs, but this thing was massive. As I stared at it, trying to figure out what I was seeing, it didn't move. I didn't want to startle it, so I figured I'd let it go about its business. I turned off the headlights, but the moment I did, it turned toward my car and locked eyes with me. I froze, thinking maybe it was just my tired brain imagining its eyes to be more intelligent than a regular animal's. But then it started to rise onto its back legs. And it wasn't just standing on two legs, it had hands. Huge, human-like hands with long, twisted fingers and claws that looked razor-sharp. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It continued to stare at me, and that's when I realized this creature had transformed from a massive wolf to something far worse. It stood over 7 feet tall. My mind tried to rationalize it, but it couldn't. I'd never believed in things like Bigfoot, aliens, or werewolves. I'm from the South, where ghost stories are common, but this was different. I had never seen anything like this before. Before I could fully comprehend what was happening, the creature took a few steps towards me. My heart raced as I finally saw it clearly, from the front now. Its chest looked like that of a bodybuilder, but its legs were more wolf-like, with oversized paws. The whole thing seemed like a nightmare come to life. It stared at me with a gaze that seemed full of hunger and malice. Then, just as quickly, it shifted its gaze to the woods on the other side of the road, and I hoped it would go there instead. It ran across the road into the trees, and I knew I had to leave, so I floored it, nearly grinding the gears in my panic to get away. I didn't stop until I felt like I had put enough distance between us. The fog was still thick, but I slowed down, wondering how much time had passed. It had felt like forever, but the clock said only a couple of minutes. I couldn't make sense of it. Despite the cold air blasting through the car, I was sweating, and chills ran down my spine. I reached an intersection near some fields. A lot of accidents had happened there before, with kids racing cars or drunks ignoring stop signs. I took a moment to calm myself, then carefully navigated the turn. Finally, I made it home. The dark woods around the house made me feel uneasy, but I rushed to the door, glancing nervously as I fumbled for my keys. Once inside, I took a few breaths to settle myself. My parents were asleep, so I didn't have to explain my frazzled state. They wouldn't have believed me anyway. I never saw that creature again, and I didn't want to, but a part of me always wondered if others had seen something similar. I never told anyone, as back then, many people in rural areas didn't have good internet. We had dial-up, but I wasn't really familiar with how to search for things online. It wasn't until years later that I finally looked into it and discovered that others around the world had reported similar encounters. At the time, I thought it was a werewolf, but I couldn't accept the idea. Now, I understand that all folklore probably has some truth to it. So, whatever it was, a werewolf or dogman, may we never meet again. I've been an avid hiker and camper for most of my life, but there's one experience that still gives me chills whenever I recall it. This happened about 7 years ago when I was backpacking through the Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina with my friend Jake. We planned a 4-day hike through some of the more remote trails, hoping to immerse ourselves in nature and escape from civilization for a while. The first 2 days were perfect. Crisp autumn weather, vibrant leaves, and that fresh, earthy smell of the forest. We saw a lot of wildlife too. Deer, some wild turkeys, and even spotted a black bear in the distance one afternoon. Everything seemed normal, at least until the third night when things took a strange and terrifying turn. We had set up camp in a small clearing about half a mile off the main trail. It was a beautiful spot, right next to a bubbling creek, surrounded by tall pines and oaks. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we lit a fire and settled down for dinner. Jake and I sat around the fire, sharing stories and enjoying the peaceful sounds of the forest at twilight. It felt cozy, full of good food, good company, and the simple joy of being out in nature. But then, as darkness fully settled in, we both noticed something unsettling. It was eerily quiet. The usual nighttime sounds were completely absent. No rustling leaves, no animal calls. It was like a switch had been flipped, silencing everything. It was a very strange silence, abrupt and unnatural. Jake and I exchanged uneasy glances. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, suddenly feeling uneasy, even though I couldn't quite explain why. We sat there for a few moments, straining to hear anything, but there was nothing except the crackling of the fire. Then we heard it, a deep, guttural growl coming from beyond the campsite. It didn't sound like any animal I knew. It was too low for a coyote or a wolf, and it had a human-like quality that sent shivers down my spine. Jake and I jumped to our feet, our flashlights darting over the tree line, but we couldn't see anything beyond the ring of firelight. Then the growl came again, this time closer. It sounded like it was coming from multiple directions at once, as if we were surrounded. "What is that?" Jake hissed, his voice filled with fear. I shook my head, completely confused. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what we were hearing. But deep down, I knew this wasn't normal. We decided to put out the fire and retreat to our tent, hoping whatever was out there would lose interest. Big mistake. As soon as the fire was out and we were left in near total darkness, the growling grew louder. It came from all around us now, a chorus of inhuman voices closing in. Before long, we saw them, glowing eyes reflected in our flashlight beams. Dozens of pairs, some at ground level, others 7 or 8 feet high. They moved through the underbrush, circling our camp, and we had no idea what they were. Inside the tent, we zipped it up and huddled together, hardly daring to breathe. The thin nylon walls offered no real protection, but at least we felt somewhat safe. We stayed like that, waiting, while the growling and rustling sounds grew louder and closer. I'll never forget the moment when I saw a huge, dark shape pass in front of the tent. The creature, if you could call it that, must have been at least 8 feet tall. It moved gracefully, almost fluidly, and definitely not like any human. As it passed, I caught a whiff of a horrible stench, like rotting meat mixed with wet dog. For hours, we heard them outside the tent. Occasionally, one would brush against the side of the tent, making it shake. The growling was constant, punctuated by what sounded like words spoken in some strange, guttural language. I was certain that at any moment, claws or teeth would tear through the tent, but somehow, miraculously, we made it through the night. When the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, the sounds and movements outside gradually faded away. Jake and I waited another hour before daring to unzip the tent and peek outside. The campsite looked completely normal in the early morning light. No tracks, no signs of any disturbance. If it weren't for the fact that we both experienced it, I might have thought it was all some shared hallucination. We packed up our gear quickly and hurried back to the main trail. We didn't say much during the hike back to the car. Both of us were lost in our thoughts, trying to process what had just happened. Over the years, I've done a lot of research, hoping to find some explanation for that night. I've come across a few Bigfoot reports from the area that have similarities, and there are also Cherokee legends about creatures called Noonie, or spirit people, who are said to live in the mountains and can appear as shadows or animals. However, none of the explanations really match what we experienced. Those glowing eyes, the impossible size of the creatures, their fluid movements, and that bone-chilling growl. It all points to something beyond traditional cryptids or folklore. Since that night, I've been back to Pisgah National Forest several times. It's a beautiful place, and I didn't want one terrifying experience to ruin my love for hiking and camping, but I've never gone back to that particular section of the trails. Now, I always make sure to camp in established campgrounds, never in isolated backcountry spots. Jake and I don't talk about that night much. It's an unspoken understanding between us. We both know what happened, but bringing it up makes it feel too real. Sometimes, I have nightmares where I'm back in that tent, hearing the growls getting closer. But instead of staying put, I unzip the tent and come face to face with something. I always wake up in a cold sweat before I can make out any details. Maybe that's for the best. These days, when I'm out in nature and night begins to fall, I listen closely to the ambient sounds of the forest. If those sounds suddenly go quiet, well, I don't stick around to find out why. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. This happened when I was 12, during a summer visit to my grandmother's house on the White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota. To give you some background, my mom is a member of the White Earth Nation, but my dad is white. We lived in Minneapolis most of the year, where my dad worked as an engineer and my mom as a social worker. Every summer, though, we would spend a few weeks up north with my grandmother, my mom's mom. I looked forward to those summers. The reservation was so different from the city. Vast forests, endless lakes, and a deep connection to nature and tradition that I didn't experience at home. My grandmother, whom I'll call Margaret here, lived in a small house on the edge of a thick forest. She was in her 70s and well respected in the community for her knowledge of traditional medicine and stories. That particular summer, there were rumors of strange disappearances. 3 people had vanished mysteriously in the woods over the past few months. The tribal police were investigating but didn't have any leads. People speculated about what might be behind it, from drug dealers and human traffickers to Bigfoot, as well as more traditional explanations. My parents were nervous about letting me wander far, but my grandmother reassured them I would be fine with her. "The forest knows its own," she said cryptically. I didn't fully understand what she meant, but I trusted her completely. One afternoon, about a week into our visit, my grandmother asked me to help her gather some herbs in the woods for a healing ceremony. My parents had gone into town, so it was just the 2 of us. I imagine they would have had quite a few concerns if they were there. We headed out into the forest behind her house. My grandmother moved with surprising agility for her age. The woods were thick and ancient, with towering pines and old oaks blocking most of the light. The forest floor was covered in ferns and moss, dotted with colorful wildflowers. As we walked, my grandmother pointed out different plants and explained their uses. She taught me how to identify and gather the herbs she needed, like fragrant sage, sweetgrass, and cedar. She also told me old Ojibwe legends about the forest and its spirits. Lowering her voice, she began to tell me about something called the Buie Wigan, wild men of the woods. They weren't exactly spirits, she said, but not quite human either. They lived deep in the forest, far from the people. Curious, I asked, "What do they look like, Grandma?" She paused, then answered, "They're said to be tall and covered in hair with long arms and legs. Some say they can turn invisible or change their shape, but few who've seen them close up have lived to tell about it." A chill ran down my spine. "Are they dangerous?" I asked. "They can be," she said, nodding seriously. "They're protectors of the forest. They don't like trespassers, but they've been known to help lost travelers. The key is respect, child. Always show respect to the forest and its inhabitants." We continued deeper into the woods as the trees grew thicker. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Maybe it was the story my grandmother had told me, but every rustle in the leaves, every snap of a twig, made me jump. "Grandma," I whispered, "do you think the disappearances could be the Buie Wigan?" She stopped and turned to face me with a serious look. "I don't know, child, but something doesn't feel right about these woods. We must be careful." We walked on in silence for a while, and the forest seemed to grow darker. Suddenly, my grandmother froze. She grabbed my arm more tightly. "Don't move," she whispered. I stood still, my heart pounding. Then I heard it, a low rumble, almost like a growl, coming from somewhere close by. Slowly, I turned my head to look at my grandmother. Her eyes were wide, scanning the forest around us. She was softly singing an old Ojibwe protection song. Then I saw it. It was about 20 to 25 yards away, partly hidden behind a large oak tree. It was tall, much taller than a man, and covered in dark, matted hair. But its shape was strange, as if it couldn't decide whether to be human or animal. For a moment, it locked eyes with me, and its eyes glowed with an eerie yellow light. A wave of fear washed over me, paralyzing me where I stood. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. No footsteps, no rustling in the leaves, just gone. My grandmother's song trailed off, and she leaned against me, looking every bit her age. "We need to go," she said, her voice trembling. We hurried back to her house, moving as quickly as we could through the woods. By the time we got back, the sun was setting, and my parents had returned. They were furious when they found out we had gone into the woods, especially given the recent disappearances. But my grandmother assured them that I was safe and that we had just lost track of time while gathering herbs. That night, after my parents went to bed, my grandmother came to my room. She sat beside me on the bed, holding my hand. "What we saw today," she said softly, "is something very few people ever encounter. I believe that was one of the Buie Wigan. We were lucky it didn't approach us." She made me promise not to speak about what happened, not even to my parents. "There are things," she said, "that belong to the old ways and must stay there." As she got up to leave, I grabbed her sleeve and asked, "Is that why you brought them up, Grandma? Because you knew they were out there before we saw it?" She smiled and nodded once. "Good night," she said, then left. I kept that promise for many years, even though the memory of that day haunted my dreams. The disappearances on the reservation stopped after that summer, though no one could explain why. My grandmother passed away a few years later, taking her knowledge of the old ways with her. Now, at 32, I have a family of my own. We still visit the reservation every summer, and we even stay in my grandmother's old house. I've never seen anything like what I saw that day, but sometimes, when I'm in the woods, I feel like I'm being watched. On quiet nights, I swear I can hear that low rumble carried on the wind, just like the one I heard years ago. These days, when I walk in those woods, I find myself humming my grandmother's protection song, just in case. I've taught my own children to respect the forest and to leave small offerings, just as she taught me. If there's one thing I learned that day, it's that there are things in this world that can't be easily explained, and sometimes the old ways are the best ways to understand them. I've been a hunter for most of my life, but there's one experience that still sends shivers down my spine when I think about it. This happened a few years ago in the Gila National Forest, located in the southwestern part of New Mexico. I was in my early 30s, working as a construction supervisor in Albuquerque. Hunting season was my escape from the stress of work and city life. I had been planning this trip for months, a solo elk hunt. I'd done it many times before. The Gila is known for its tough terrain and abundant wildlife, making it a prime hunting spot. I had hunted there several times before, but this time I was heading into a more remote area I had never explored. The week leading up to my trip was hectic. We were behind schedule on a big project at work, and I was putting in 12-hour days trying to get everything back on track. By the time Friday came, I was exhausted, but still determined not to let it affect my hunting plans. I drove the 4 hours to the forest, arriving just before sunset. I set up camp in a small clearing about a mile off the main road, the perfect spot, secluded and close to a small stream. I had a quick dinner of canned chili heated over the campfire, then went over some topographical maps to plan my route for the next day. The area I was aiming for was about 3 miles deeper into the woods, a valley known for having good elk habitats. I turned in early, wanting to get a good night's rest before my early morning start. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of small animals. I quickly fell asleep. I woke up well before dawn, had a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and coffee, then set out. The hike was tough, steep and rocky, but as the sky began to brighten, I found myself enjoying the solitude. By mid-morning, I had reached the valley I was aiming for. It was such a beautiful spot, a small meadow surrounded by dense pine trees. I found a good vantage point on a rocky outcrop and settled in, rifle in hand, ready to wait. I stayed there for hours, but there was no sign of elk. I did spot other wildlife, though: mule deer, wild turkeys, and even a black bear in the distance. Everything seemed to be there except for the elk. As the sun started to set, I decided to head back to camp. I was disappointed but not too discouraged. That's just how hunting goes sometimes. I was about halfway back to my campsite when things started to get strange. If you've spent much time in the woods, you know that when it suddenly goes completely silent, it means one of two things. Either you're too loud or something else is out there with you. That's exactly what happened, but this silence felt different. It was as if the world had been sucked dry of sound. I stopped and listened closely, gripping my rifle tighter. Then came the smell. It was strong and musky, and it freaked me out because I couldn't recognize it. Not quite like a bear or a mountain lion. The only thing I knew for sure was that it was from something large. I felt afraid. Slowly, I turned, scanning the woods. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but after a moment, I was sure. Pair of eyes. Then another pair and another. There were dozens of them, scattered among the trees. Some were low to the ground, others impossibly high up. My heart raced. What kind of animal could this be? Their eyes were too big, and there seemed to be an intelligence behind them. They could climb trees if they wanted to or choose not to, and whatever they were, they had me completely surrounded. I walked faster, trying to stay calm, hoping they would let me go. But as I moved, I heard them moving too. I even heard branches snapping under the weight of something heavy. Then I heard the howl. Started low, so low it was almost felt instead of heard. It rose in pitch, becoming a sound that made my hair stand on end. It was so different from any wolf or coyote howl. It was deep and guttural, with a strange, almost human-like quality that sent chills through me. More howls joined in, creating a chorus in the woods. I broke into a run. By that point, I wasn't thinking about being stealthy or dignified. Survival instincts kicked in, and I ran as fast as I could. I could hear them behind me, heavy footsteps and that terrible howling. I even thought I could hear them jumping through the trees. Whatever they were fast despite their size. I've never run so hard in my life. My lungs burned, and I thought they were going to collapse, but I kept going. I could feel them getting closer. Maybe I even felt their hot breath on my neck, but it was probably just my own fear. Before I knew it, I was near my camp. I burst out of the trees into the clearing where I had set up. I didn't stop to grab anything. I just ran toward my truck, fumbling for the keys as I ran. I jumped into the driver's seat and started the engine, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in. As I slammed the truck into gear and sped off, I caught a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror, a shape darker than the surrounding trees, standing at the edge of the clearing. It was huge, and something about it just felt wrong. I forced myself to look away as I fishtailed onto the forest road. I drove like a madman, not slowing down until I hit the highway. It wasn't until I was halfway back to Albuquerque that I realized I had left all my camping gear behind. The next day, after a sleepless night, I called the forest ranger station and tried to explain what happened without sounding crazy. The ranger listened patiently, then told me something that made my blood run cold. Apparently, over the years, there had been other reports, though not many, but enough to form a pattern. They all came from the same area of the forest, and they all involved multiple creatures. They always mentioned that distinctive howl. The ranger didn't have any explanation, but he advised me to be more careful if I ever decided to hunt in that area again. Fat chance. On a chilly autumn evening, Emily and her friends decided to explore the dense woods that bordered their small town in the mountains. The locals often whispered about strange happenings in the forest, but the group dismissed them as nothing more than tales meant to frighten children. Equipped with flashlights and a sense of curiosity, they laughed and joked as they ventured further into the shadows of the trees. As they walked, a fog began to roll in, enveloping the woods and muffling their laughter. The air felt heavier, and their mood shifted from carefree to uneasy. Sarah couldn't shake the sensation that they were being watched. She looked over her shoulder, but all she could see was the thickening mist and the twisted branches of the trees. Hours passed, and they realized they were lost. The woods around them seemed to change. Paths they had walked on earlier vanished, and new ones appeared. They tried using their phones, but there was no signal. Panic began to rise, and the thought of spending the night in the forest started to seem like a real possibility. They stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin. Its windows were shattered, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. Desperate for shelter, they decided to take refuge inside. The inside of the cabin was musty and dark, filled with broken furniture and thick cobwebs. They huddled together in one corner, hoping to make it through the night without incident. As the hours passed, eerie noises began to echo through the cabin. Faint whispers, almost inaudible, seemed to come from the walls themselves. Emily strained her ears to hear, but the words were indecipherable. The whispers grew louder and more urgent, filling the air with a chilling energy. Suddenly, one of her friends, John, screamed. He pointed to a far corner of the room where a shadowy figure stood, its hollow eyes staring at them. The figure moved toward them, its form shifting and swirling as though made of smoke. The whispers became a relentless chorus, their incoherent murmurs rattling their minds. Terrified, they tried to flee, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping them inside. The shadowy figure advanced, and an icy cold seemed to settle into their bones. Emily's flashlight flickered and then died, plunging them into darkness. The whispers became a chaotic chorus of voices, each one more desperate and tortured than the last. In the suffocating blackness, Emily felt something cold and clammy brush against her skin. She screamed, feeling unseen hands grip her arms and legs. The figure loomed over her, its face twisted into a grotesque grin. She could feel its cold breath on her face, the stench of decay thick in the air. Just as the terror seemed unbearable, her friend Kate managed to turn on her flashlight, sending a beam of light cutting through the dark. The shadow recoiled, dissolving into the shadows from which it had come. The whispers faded, leaving only an oppressive silence behind. They spent the rest of the night huddled together, too frightened to move. When the first light of morning finally appeared, they cautiously opened the cabin door and stepped out into the pale daylight. The forest seemed less menacing in the daylight, but they were all deeply shaken by what they had experienced. The townspeople found Emily and her friends wandering the edge of the woods, confused and disoriented. They couldn't remember how they had escaped the cabin or what had happened that night, but they all shared the same haunting memory of the shadowy figure and the whispers that seemed to come from the very walls. Years later, Emily still wakes up in a cold sweat, hearing the faint whispers in her dreams. She avoids the woods entirely now, terrified that if she ever goes back, she might not be so lucky to make it out. The cabin, known by locals as the home of the Whispering Shadows, remains a forbidden place, its dark secret shared only in hushed tones by those who know its true horror. Emma had always enjoyed the peace of the countryside. She moved to a small, scenic village to escape the chaos of city life. Her new home was near a thick forest, and she often took long walks there to clear her mind. The villagers warned her about the woods, telling tales of lost children who roamed the trees. Emma didn't believe in these stories, thinking they were just local legends, until one fateful evening. It was a warm summer night, and Emma decided to take a walk before sundown. She ventured farther into the forest than usual, drawn in by the beauty of the tall trees and the golden light filtering through the branches. As evening approached, she realized she had lost track of time and needed to head back. But as she turned to leave, she heard faint laughter, the sound of children laughing, distant but clear. Curious, she followed the noise, which led her to a small, overgrown clearing. There, she saw 3 children, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, playing near an ancient stone well. Their laughter echoed eerily through the quiet woods. Emma cautiously called out to them. The children stopped and turned to look at her, their eyes dark and empty. They didn't speak, just stared with an intensity that made her shiver. She asked if they were lost, but they remained silent. As she stepped closer, they vanished, leaving behind a cold, empty feeling. Disturbed, Emma hurried back home. The image of the ghostly children stayed with her, lingering in her thoughts. That night, she dreamed of them, their vacant eyes piercing her soul. She woke up in a cold sweat, the sound of their laughter still echoing in her ears. Over the next few days, Emma tried to forget about what she had seen, but the children began appearing everywhere. She saw them in the reflections of windows, standing at the edge of the woods, and even in her dreams. Their laughter grew louder and more menacing, and she felt their presence constantly. One evening, Emma decided to confront the children. She returned to the clearing, determined to learn who they were and why they were haunting her. As she approached the well, she felt an icy chill. The children appeared again, their expressions darker than before. They circled her, whispering in voices that sounded like the wind rustling through the trees. She asked them what they wanted, but they only laughed, their eerie sound sending shivers down her spine. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and the well seemed to grow darker, like an abyss of shadows. She felt herself being pulled toward it, an invisible force dragging her closer. Emma tried to resist, but the pull was too strong. She reached for the edge of the well, but her hand passed through it as if it were made of mist. She felt herself falling, the darkness swallowing her whole. The last thing she heard was the sound of the children's laughter, echoing in the void. When she awoke, she was lying on the forest floor, the sun shining through the trees. Disoriented and terrified, she stumbled back to her home. It was then she realized the children were not just ghosts. They were something far more sinister, entities that thrived on fear and despair. From that point on, Emma became a recluse, haunted by the laughter of the ghostly children. She warned others to stay away from the woods, but few listened. The villagers continued to share their tales, but few knew the true horror that lurked in the trees. Years later, Emma's house was found abandoned. No one knew what had happened to her, but some claimed to have seen her wandering the woods at night, a lost soul trapped by the children. The laughter still echoed through the trees, a chilling reminder of the darkness within the forest. As the years went by, the legend of the ghostly children grew. New residents of the village heard whispers about the haunted woods and the well that seemed like a portal to another world. Those who ventured too close spoke of strange occurrences, cold spots, disembodied laughter, and a feeling of being watched. One brave group of teenagers, intrigued by the stories, decided to investigate the well. Armed with flashlights and recording equipment, they entered the woods at dusk, their hearts racing with a mix of fear and excitement. As they approached the clearing, the air grew colder. The glowing moss cast an eerie light, and the ancient well stood at the center like a dark sentinel. The teenagers gathered around it, their flashlights flickering in the unnatural cold. They heard the faint sound of children laughing, and their equipment began malfunctioning. One of the boys, Jake, leaned over the edge of the well, shining his flashlight into the darkness below. He saw nothing but shadow. Suddenly, a hand shot out and grabbed his wrist, its grip like iron. He screamed as he was pulled toward the well. The others tried to help, but in the struggle, Jake was dragged into the well, disappearing into the darkness. Terrified, the remaining teenagers ran from the woods, their screams echoing through the trees. They returned to town, frantic and incoherent, telling stories of ghostly children and a well that had swallowed their friend. A search party was organized, but Jake was never found. The well was sealed, and the clearing was declared off-limits. Though the town tried to move on, the legend of the ghostly children and the well endured. Emma's warning echoed in their minds, a chilling reminder of the darkness that lay just beyond their homes. To this day, the woods remain a place of fear, and the laughter of the ghostly children can still be heard on quiet nights. A haunting melody that chills the blood of anyone who hears it. The well stands as a silent sentinel, a gateway to a darkness that will never be fully understood. Emma, forever lost in the woods, serves as a warning to those who dare to venture too deep. James had always enjoyed hiking. Growing up in a rural area, he often explored the vast forests near his home. One summer, he decided to go deeper into the woods than he ever had before, venturing into an area the locals avoided. They spoke of strange lights and unsettling sounds, but James didn't believe in such things. He packed his gear and set off early one morning, eager to uncover the truth. As he walked through the forest, he noticed an eerie silence. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves were absent, replaced by an oppressive stillness. The deeper he went, the denser the trees became, their branches intertwining above him to create an almost impenetrable canopy. Despite a growing sense of unease, James continued on. By late afternoon, he found himself in a clearing. It was a perfect circle, devoid of trees, and bathed in an otherworldly glow. The ground was covered in strange, glowing moss that seemed to emit light from within. At the center of the clearing stood an ancient oak tree, its twisted branches reaching up like skeletal fingers. James felt an inexplicable pull toward the tree, an urge he couldn't resist. As he approached, he saw strange symbols carved into the bark. They had no clear meaning but radiated a sinister energy. He reached out to touch them, and as soon as his fingers made contact with the wood, an overwhelming cold swept over him. The temperature dropped rapidly, and the light in the clearing began to dim. Shadows began to move and twist around him, forming shapes that made no sense. He tried to step back, but his feet felt frozen to the ground. The air became thick and suffocating, making it hard to breathe. Faint whispers filled the air, growing louder and more chaotic. Panicked, James turned to run, but the shadows closed in on him, surrounding him from all sides. He stumbled and fell, his hands touching the mossy ground, which felt like ice. The whispers turned into screams, and twisted, tormented faces appeared in the darkness. He managed to scramble to his feet and ran, desperate to escape the haunted clearing. Hours later, he stumbled through the tree line, gasping for air. He had no idea how he found his way out, but he was relieved to be free of the woods. He made his way home, shaken and exhausted. That night, he dreamt of the clearing, the ancient tree, and the haunting whispers. In the days that followed, James noticed strange things happening around him. Objects moved on their own, and he would hear whispers in the dead of night. It felt as if he was being watched, a constant presence lurking just beyond his sight. The odd occurrences escalated, and soon he began to see shadowy figures at the edge of his vision. One night, he woke up to find himself back in the clearing. The glowing moss was brighter than ever, and the ancient oak loomed over him. Shadows danced around him, their whispers deafening. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. The symbols on the tree began to glow, and he felt an intense, burning pain as they seemed to sear into his skin. When he finally woke up in his bed, drenched in sweat, he checked his body. To his horror, the symbols were etched into his flesh, faintly glowing in the dark. He knew then that he was forever marked, bound to the haunted clearing. No matter where he went, the shadows followed, and the whispers never ceased. James withdrew from the world, terrified of what he had unleashed. He tried to warn others to stay away from the woods, but few believed him. He spent his days researching the symbols, searching for a way to break the curse. But deep down, he knew the shadows would never let him go. The haunted clearing had claimed him, and he was forever trapped in its grip. As time passed, the glowing moss spread beyond the clearing, slowly creeping into the surrounding forest. More people reported strange occurrences, and the ghost stories that had once been dismissed gained new credibility. The forest became a place of fear, avoided by those who valued their sanity. In the final months of his life, James was consumed by terror. He could no longer distinguish between waking and dreaming, as the shadows and whispers tormented him relentlessly. On the night of a full moon, he disappeared without a trace, leaving only his journal behind. His notes were filled with desperate pleas and cryptic symbols. The town posted warnings around the forest, but the haunted clearing remained. It was a place where reality twisted into nightmare. Those who dared to search for it never returned the same, if they returned at all. The whispers of the haunted clearing echoed through the woods, a chilling reminder of the ancient evil that lurked there. Not all monsters are truly monsters. I was 10 years old in June 1990 when my parents separated and then divorced shortly after. At the time, we lived in Colorado Springs, Colorado, where my dad was stationed at Fort Carson. We were a military family and, as it happened, an outdoorsy one. My dad and I enjoyed the outdoors, while my mom and older sister didn't care for it much. I loved camping, hiking, fishing, and horseback riding. After the divorce, my mom took my sister and moved to Price, Utah, to live with our grandmother, leaving me behind. It was quite a change, not to mention a cultural shock. We moved to Utah in November 1990, and in January 1991, on my birthday, I just wanted to get outside and explore. I was an 11-year-old kid, hurt and angry at all the changes in our family, and no one seemed to care how it made me feel. I begged to go outside and threw tantrums. I was new to the desert landscape and was more than curious about it. At the time, my mom started dating a man. They had been seeing each other for about 2 months when he offered to take us camping. He said he understood why I was angry and wanted to make me happy. This sounded good to me. At the end of February, he took my sister, who was 5 years older than me, my mom, and me to the San Rafael Desert in southern Utah for a 2-night camping trip. I was so excited. Just before we were about to leave, my mom's work called, saying she had to work Saturday even though she had requested the weekend off. Being at the bottom of the totem pole, she had no choice but to go in. We left for the desert on Friday, and Saturday morning after breakfast, my mom left for work, taking my sister, who was learning to drive, with her. That left me alone with her boyfriend. First, everything was fine. We hiked up a mesa to a cave, where he showed me some Native American cave paintings. He taught me how to look for arrowheads and flint, and told me about the Navajo and Paiute tribes that once inhabited the area. I was fascinated, but then, as if a cloud had passed over the sun, his mood shifted dramatically. To this day, I don't know if it was something I did or if it was just because of me, but suddenly he started saying that I was a bad child, a brat who didn't deserve his kindness or knowledge. He told me that my mom deserved a better daughter and that everyone would be better off if I just disappeared into the desert. He claimed my mom hated camping and that's why she agreed to go on the trip, to get rid of me. I was confused, but as an 11-year-old, it made sense to me. Now, if you don't know about Utah's desert weather in the winter, it can be warm during the day but drop below freezing at night. It was nice that day, so I wasn't wearing a coat, just jeans and a t-shirt. Then he told me to start running because if I ran, he wouldn't have to hurt me. I watched as he loaded what looked like a handgun. I wasn't very knowledgeable about guns back then, so I just did what he said and ran. I didn't even know where I was going. I just cried and ran, scared. I have no idea how far or long I ran. All I knew was I had to get away. When I finally felt it was safe to stop, I couldn't see the camp or the smoke from the fire anymore, so I started looking for a place to hide. I found another cave and stayed there for a while. I don't know how much time passed, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I knew he would eventually find me, and that would be the end. I felt like I had no one, so I decided to find someone. But where? I remembered my dad telling me that if I ever got lost in the mountains, I should find a river and follow it downstream. It would lead me to civilization. So, I set off in search of a river that I found it, and began following it downstream, walking without much direction, lost in thoughts about how my mom didn't want me and how I should never have begged to go camping. I thought it was my fault and that I was probably going to die out here alone. The sun was starting to set, around 4:30 or 5 p.m. I had been walking since 10 a.m., and it was getting colder. I tripped and fell into a small river, wet and even more terrified. But the shock of the cold water made me focus. I needed shelter. At that point, I didn't know what kind of animals lived in the desert, bears, wolves, but I didn't care. I just wanted to survive. I would apologize to my mom, promise I'd be better, and ask to come home. I found a small alcove, more like a tiny cave, just big enough for me to curl up in. I tried to calm myself, but it was so cold, and the temperature dropped steadily, maybe to 38 degrees Fahrenheit that night. It wasn't freezing, but it felt close. Then the howling began. It was probably coyotes, but I'd never seen coyotes that big, nor had I ever seen coyotes walking on two legs. There were at least 5 of them, moving quickly around me in the dark. The only light was the dim moon, but I didn't care. I just wanted them to go away or end it quickly. I was too scared to think straight. I don't know how I fell asleep, but when I woke, it was just before dawn, in that quiet time between night and day. My legs were numb, and every time I moved, I felt sharp pains from the cold. I was starving, thirsty, and still scared. And then I saw it, a large dog or wolf standing on top of a ridge. It yipped at me, then ran off. I was too weak to move, but it came back, this time at the bottom of the ridge, a good distance away. It yipped again, then turned and walked away slowly, glancing back at me every few steps. I figured it wanted me to follow it, so I did. What else did I have to do? I followed it for what seemed like an hour, maybe longer. The sun was up now, and when the creature stopped and turned around, I heard the sound of an engine. A park ranger's truck appeared, and I was never so happy to see a person in my life. I tried to jump up and down, but my legs were too weak, and I collapsed. The ranger grabbed me, put me in the passenger seat, and radioed in that I'd been found. He gave me a Snickers and a Coke, the best I'd ever had. That I found out that I had severe hypothermia and frostbite on my feet, to the point they wanted to amputate a few toes. I'm glad my mom refused, though I still have nerve damage in them. Cold weather makes the pain unbearable sometimes. I also found out that my mom didn't want me out there. Her boyfriend wanted her to himself and saw me as an obstacle. After I disappeared, he called my mom at work and told her I was gone, that she was free. Apparently, he realized his mistake and fled. They never found him. Years later, when I was 15, I was with my best friend, who was full-blooded Navajo. She asked me to tell her great-grandmother about what happened. Her grandmother spoke of a legend about skinwalkers in the San Rafael Swell. Creatures that weren't hostile but just wanted to be left alone. Maybe it was a hallucination, brought on by my young mind and hypothermia. Or maybe not. In the end, the only true monster in my story was human. But whoever or whatever it was that helped me survive, I'm grateful. I'm still affected by it today. I get emotionally overwhelmed when I feel lost or too cold, and I can't control it. I know it's some kind of trauma response. This story begins on a warm summer evening at a friend's house about 6 months ago. My friends Cole, Andre, Lucas, and I were hanging out at Cole's place, our usual weekend spot. It was around 7:30 p.m., and we were in his basement playing video games like we always did. At one point, Lucas lost in the game and got so mad that he threw his controller on the floor, breaking it. Cole wasn't happy since it was his controller. Feeling bad, Lucas promised to buy him a new one if we went to Walmart. We often got bored at night and ended up going there anyway, especially since there was a Taco Bell right next door, and none of us had eaten dinner yet. So we got into Cole's Honda Civic and drove to Walmart. With a new controller in hand and Taco Bell in our stomachs, we hung out in the parking lot of Taco Bell, talking. Somehow, the conversation turned to substances, and Lucas mentioned a nearby store that sold special gummies. Now, I had never tried anything like that before and wasn't particularly interested, but when the others heard about these gummies, they were curious. We went to the store, gave Lucas about $30, and he quickly returned with the gummies. Cole, worried his mom would find out, suggested we try them somewhere else. I remembered my family had a small cabin about 20 minutes away, and I suggested we head there. The guys were instantly on board with the idea, so we made our way to the cabin. For context, this wasn't some old creepy cabin from horror movies. It was a fairly modern, small house with a bedroom and bathroom to the right, and a kitchen with another smaller bedroom that had 4 bunk beds to the left. Straight ahead from the front door was a small living room. The property had woods on one side and a big hill in the back, with the cabin sitting at the top. There was a cornfield at the bottom of the hill, and a wooden storage shed about 50 yards to the left of the cabin where we stored our four-wheelers and other stuff. When we arrived, I felt uneasy, like someone was watching us. As we stopped the car, I got out and looked around. I glanced at the storage shed and thought I saw a quick flash behind it, but I dismissed it as my imagination. We went into the cabin, and the guys were excited to try the gummies. They were acting like kids on Christmas, eager to unwrap their presents. I volunteered to stay sober since someone needed to drive us back home. About 30 minutes later, Andre started acting strangely. He laughed at anything anyone said. Then Cole started acting the same. It was clear the gummies were kicking in. Cole put in his AirPods, and it seemed like he was having his own little concert in his head. Meanwhile, Andre connected to our speaker and started dancing to Sweet Caroline. Lucas seemed fine, about as sober as I was, which surprised me since I thought these gummies would have the same effect on everyone. 2 to 3 hours passed, and things began to quiet down in the cabin. It was about 2 a.m. by then. Cole went to bed in the bedroom, Lucas passed out on the couch, and Andre said he was going outside to listen to music in his car. I went into the other bedroom, turned on the light, and tried to get some sleep. But soon, I heard a tapping sound on the window in the middle of the room. I mustered up some courage and got up to check, but saw nothing. Still, the tapping continued. I sat there, waiting for something to appear, but after a while, it stopped. I sighed and tried to go back to sleep. Suddenly, my phone rang. Who calls at this hour? I thought. I looked at the screen and saw it was my dad. I answered with a groggy hello. Hey, sport. I saw on the trail cameras that you guys are at the cabin. Just wanted to let you know I might come down in the morning to do some hunting. Can you get my bow ready? Sure, Dad, I said, feeling a little more awake. I'll get it ready for you. After I hung up, I got up to grab his bow, which was on the other bunk bed. I also sorted out his arrows. Then I remembered that Andre was still out in his car. I called him and told him to come back inside. I didn't want my dad to find him asleep in the car in the morning. Andre said he would be inside soon. I went back to bed, but about 5 minutes later, I heard the door handle jiggling. At first, I was startled, but then I remembered the door locks automatically. I assumed it was just Andre trying to get in. I went over to the door to unlock it, but when I looked out the front door window, I froze. Right outside the door was a tall figure, so tall that its shoulders were level with the top of the door frame. The skin was gray and stretched tight, like clay. It looked like it hadn't eaten in months, and I could almost see its ribs sticking out. Then it lowered its head so I could see its face, and that was when I knew this wasn't just some person. The face was terrifying. Black eyes with holes where skin should have been, and teeth sharp and jagged. The thing spoke in a voice that was almost identical to Andre's. "Let me in." I knew right away I couldn't let it in. Who knows where Andre was? I snapped out of my trance and remembered my dad's 12-gauge shotgun, which was in the other bedroom. The shotgun shells were on the table in the living room. I ran to grab the gun, and I guess Lucas heard me. He woke up and saw the creature standing at the door. "What is that?" Lucas screamed, jumping up. The creature, seeing him, started shaking the door handle so violently that I thought it would come off. I ran into the bedroom, grabbed the shotgun, and loaded it with shells. I had grown up with guns, so I wasn't too nervous when I fired. The shot hit, and the creature screamed, a sound like a fox. I could hear its footsteps as it ran away from the cabin, down the hill, and into the cornfield. It was fast, too fast. The distance from the cabin to the cornfield was at least 250 yards, but the creature covered that distance in just a few seconds. We rushed to get Cole, who was still woozy, and Lucas followed us. We ran to Cole's car and found Andre asleep in the driver's seat. We didn't have the energy to move him, so we just hopped in and drove back to Cole's house. After that night, I've never gone back to my family's cabin. This happened at a campground in North Carolina called Sandy Ridge in the summer of 2022. I wasn't alone in the woods. I was with my younger sister. When we first arrived, we were disappointed because we had been expecting a pool based on the website, but there wasn't one. So I thought, now what? We grabbed the campground brochure, which mentioned hiking trails, so we headed to the office to ask the woman behind the desk for more details. The campground was run by an older couple, and the lady working at the desk was the owner's wife. She told us that the pool was still under construction, but there were ponds in the woods, and we could ask her husband about them, as he was out on the trails doing maintenance. My sister and I drove off in a golf cart, and pretty soon we found the owner. He was on a tractor and told us enthusiastically that there were 400 acres of trails to explore. He mentioned that the dirt trails might not show up on maps. He also said if we went out just before sunset, we could spot bunnies on one of the more distant trails. At the time, I thought that sounded nice, but looking back, I wonder why I would go deep into unfamiliar woods right before dark. But I was naive, so we spent the rest of the day exploring. We found a skull, though I couldn't identify it. Since I'm not from the country, I sent a picture of it to one of my friends who is, and she didn't know what it was either, so that was strange. I stuck it under the seat of the golf cart to show my dad later. On our way back to the campground, we noticed a little house right at the entrance to the trails. There were many trails, and some split into others that seemed endless. As it got darker, we got stuck in the sand. I remember thinking, great, but I tried to stay calm and be the brave older sister. I tried to push the cart, but that didn't work, so I decided to call the owner for help. I figured he would be on his tractor and could easily come help us out. When I called, I thought it would take him 20 minutes or so to reach us, but he was there in less than 5 minutes. I was a little scared, not used to the woods, but I was relieved to see him so quickly, even though it seemed odd. As he helped get the golf cart unstuck, I asked him if hunting was allowed on the property. I wasn't really interested in hunting, but I wanted to ask about the skull without telling him that directly. He quickly freed the cart, and we thanked him before heading back to the campground. My dad was upset we didn't just call him to come with his truck, but I wasn't sure if it would fit on the trails. I showed him the skull, and he pointed out a small hole in it where a bullet had struck. I just nodded and told my sister. She's usually quiet around others, but she commented that it was strange. The next day, we took the golf cart out, blasting music since no one else was around. My sister noticed a hunting stand by the spot the owner had mentioned for seeing bunnies. It was so well hidden that it would have been easy for someone to sit there and watch. On another day, we stayed out late, and I saw something fall from the sky, making strange noises. It was almost dark by then, and I knew whatever it was had fallen into a gross ditch nearby. My sister and I grabbed the golf cart to check it out, but the cart couldn't fit off the trail in that area. I told my sister to stay put while I walked a little further. Suddenly, I got a strong feeling that something was wrong. I didn't say anything but quickly backed up and hopped back on the golf cart. As we sped away, I heard something following us through the woods. We got about 100 feet from the campground before the golf cart got stuck again. I told my sister to keep the gas on while I pushed. The adrenaline helped, and I got it unstuck. I jumped onto the back and climbed to the front to drive us back to the campsite. My heart was racing. A few days passed before I felt brave enough to explore again. On that day, we found a trail marked with a "Do Not Cross" sign, and there were chains wrapped around trees blocking it. We were foolish kids, so we ignored it and went around. The area was mostly sand, but luckily, we didn't get stuck. We found a sweatshirt hanging from a tree and kept going. We went deeper into the woods, and eventually we came across a road that led to a driveway and a hill. We followed it and ended up at a large log cabin. We didn't get too close, but the trees around it were unnaturally straight and organized. On our way back, we found another hunting stand, this one rusty and toppled over. When we reached the "Do Not Cross" area again, the owner was there. I played it off and pretended we had gotten lost. He said it was fine and unlocked the chains so we could pass. We thanked him and hurried back. The next day, we went back to take a picture of the log cabin, but the driveway was blocked off, so it was clear he knew we had been there. We went past the old, rusted hunting stand again and found a large barrel filled with something, surrounded by trash bags partially buried in the sand. There was another trail nearby, and I remember thinking it was better than going back through the chained-off area, so we followed it. Eventually, it led us back to a familiar trail, which took us back to the campground. On our last night there, we went on one final ride. It wasn't directly scary, but there was an unsettling feeling like we were being watched everywhere we went. We weren't sure what was going on, but it was definitely creepy. For the sake of this story, I'll create some new names for the people who were with me at the time. Sarah is my current girlfriend, John is one of my closest friends from childhood, and Robert is someone I met a couple of years ago at school. Sarah can't speak because of an accident that damaged her throat, so we learned sign language to make communication easier. John comes from a military family and knows a lot about things like benefits, ASFOB, etc. Robert is a stubborn guy who doesn't back down easily. One day, as John and I were talking, I got a message from Robert saying, "Bro, I found this abandoned 2-story house nearby. Want to check it out?" I thought about it for a second and then asked John what he thought. He liked the idea because we had nothing else to do, and it was Friday. I asked Robert if John and Sarah could come too, and he said, "Sure." I checked with Sarah about the house, and she seemed hesitant but agreed. We all met up at Robert's place and started walking toward the abandoned house. About 20 minutes in, John asked Robert if he even knew where we were going. A bit annoyed, Robert said it was just around the corner. A couple of minutes later, we found the place. We went around the back, and John found an unlocked window. We all climbed in and began exploring. After about 10 minutes, Robert started talking about the history of the house. He said it once belonged to a large family who lived there for years. One night, a psychopath broke in and began killing them one by one. Robert mentioned that the killer was known as the town's reaper for taking lives without getting caught. I had to know when this happened, and Robert said it was about 20 years ago. The bank then bought the land and tried to sell it, but most people backed out. Strangely, the few who did buy the house always left by the 6th day. John and I were intrigued by the story, but Sarah didn't seem to like it. She never really liked horror stories. I reassured her it was just a story, but she gave me a look that said she wanted to leave. I promised her we would wrap up soon and finish exploring. By then, it was getting dark. John suggested we head back to Robert's, and we all agreed. Sarah looked relieved to leave the house. I was a little disappointed because I love horror, and it's rare to find a place with such an eerie story. As Robert tried to open the window we came through, it wouldn't budge. John said it couldn't be right because we had found it wide open. We started searching the house for another way out. Sarah held onto my arm, growing more paranoid. I tried to calm her down, but she was too scared. I went to the front door and tried to open it, but of course it didn't budge. John said he saw a broken window upstairs, and we all headed in that direction. As we walked, Robert started hearing tapping from the room next to him. The sound was faint, and he didn't pay much attention, shrugging it off. When we found the room with the broken window, Sarah whispered that John was missing. I could tell she was getting more scared. When something serious happens or feels threatening, Robert gets a serious look on his face. He pulled out his knife and started looking for John. Sarah grabbed his arm, trying to stop him, but even she knew it was pointless. Robert was one of those no man left behind types. He told her he wasn't leaving without John and went off to find him. I stayed behind to clear the sharp glass from the window. After finishing, I had Sarah climb out first, then I followed. As I looked back, I saw red eyes in the next room. I kept calm and helped Sarah down from the small balcony. She was desperate to leave, but I told her I couldn't just leave without knowing if the others were okay. About 10 minutes later, I decided to go find them. Sarah grabbed my arm and gave me a pleading look, but I couldn't leave her there alone, especially with that thing I saw. I didn't mention the eyes to her, though. Instead, I decided to call the police to search the house. When the officers arrived, I told them what had happened. They didn't seem to believe me, but one of the officers noticed how scared Sarah was. He and his partner went into the house to look for Robert and John. They came back and said the house was empty, with no sign of anyone inside. Maybe it was the shock on our faces, but the officer asked if we had been drinking or on drugs. We weren't, but when we told him that, he looked concerned. He offered to drive us home, so I gave him Robert's address so we could grab my truck. 2 days later, there was still no word from Robert or John. On Monday morning, I got a text from Robert about the math homework he had forgotten to do. I thought it was a prank because of what had happened, so I asked him a few things that only Robert would know. I was trying to catch him, but he answered everything correctly. I then asked if he remembered what happened over the weekend, and he said he had no idea what I was talking about. I asked him about John, and he told me he hadn't seen John in years. I was confused. That's when I started noticing that other students at school were saying the same thing about John. What happened to him? Why were people acting so strange? I talked to Sarah about it, and she remembered everything clearly. So what really happened to Robert and John? Then, what's in my house? From sleepless nights 2 years ago, my 22-year-old husband Max, my 27-year-old brother Alex, and I, a 22-year-old woman, moved into a rented home. For the first month, everything seemed normal. Then, one evening after work, things changed. I worked until 8 p.m., so Max and Alex would get home much earlier. That evening, when I walked in, I found them sitting in the living room, looking shaken. Alex said something strange had just happened. He described hearing loud footsteps walking around upstairs. It's important to note that the house's floors are very thin, so sounds easily carried. Alex said the footsteps continued for a few minutes and then stopped. Max had gone upstairs to check, but found nothing. No reason for the noise. It happened again one night while I was working late, but the strange events started affecting me more directly. Our bedroom door has a sliding lock. You have to lift the metal bar, slide it across, and it stays in place between two prongs so it can't be opened. One night, I woke up to a loud noise. I instantly recognized it. It was the sliding lock rattling, as if someone was trying to open it. My heart raced. I shook Max to wake him up, but he's a heavy sleeper. When I called his name, the noise suddenly stopped, and the room fell silent. I froze, staring at the door, heart pounding in my chest. The next morning, I told Max what had happened, and he tried to calm me down, though I could tell he was nervous. 2. A month later, it happened again. I woke up to the same sound, the lock jiggling. This time, I shook Max until he woke up immediately, asking what was wrong. But once again, the noise stopped. I explained what happened, and though he was hesitant, he got up to check. He opened the door, looked around, but found no one, and nothing had been moved. At first, he suggested maybe Alex was playing tricks on us, but we could hear him snoring in his room, and his door makes a loud creak when it opens. We didn't hear it open or close. I barely slept that night. As time passed, smaller things started happening. I'd sometimes catch sight of a dark shape from the corner of my eye, usually near doorways, especially around the laundry room and the bathroom upstairs. The feeling of being watched, especially in the upstairs bathroom, became constant. Next to the bathroom, we kept a spare room for storage, but something about that room felt off. I don't know how to explain it other than a strange, unsettling energy, even though nothing unusual had actually happened in there. This went on for months until one terrifying night. Max and I were home. Alex was working a night shift, so it was just us. We were watching videos, talking about them between pauses, so the house was otherwise quiet. Then, suddenly, there was a huge crash downstairs. The whole house shook. We were convinced someone had broken in. We grabbed anything we could use to protect ourselves. There was a quieter noise afterward, and I was frozen with fear. Max wanted to check it out, but I was sure there was an intruder, so I begged him not to go. He cautiously peeked out of our door to listen but didn't hear anything. I told him to lock the door to the stairs, which he did, and we braced ourselves. After debating for a while, we decided to go investigate. We checked each room upstairs, even this odd door near the bathroom with a lock on it. When opened, it revealed a slanted green wall that didn't seem to serve any purpose. Then we carefully went downstairs, each step creaking loudly. We checked each room, but there was no sign of anyone. The front and back doors were still locked. We searched to see if anything had fallen but found nothing. To this day, we still don't know what caused the crash or how it shook the entire house. We still live here, and though things still happen, they're less frequent. Recently, I felt something behind me. I even heard a sigh near my ear while I was about to shower. The latest incident happened just a week ago. I was alone and bored, so I decided to download a free ghost hunting app. It was like a spirit box, but without static. I began asking basic questions like, "Is anyone here?" with no response. I almost deleted it, but tried one more time, asking, "What's your name?" To my surprise, it responded with a name, James. I paused, startled, trying to tell myself it was just random. I kept asking questions, getting vague replies. Then I got another name, Sarah. I asked where they were, and later, while retelling this to Max, I realized the device had said top. I thought it was referring to my shirt, but when I asked what they meant, it went silent. When I asked, "Where are you?" it replied, "Above you." That was the only time I received a full sentence. Most responses had been single words. And remember that odd door with the green wall? Lately, the bolt has started unlocking by itself. None of us do it, and we tell each other every time it happens. We fix it, but it always comes undone again. That's where we leave the story for now. It was the first time Seattle had ever made it to the Super Bowl back in 2005. I remember it mainly because the loud cheers that filled the air surrounded my friend and me as we wandered through the woods, uncertain if we'd make it out of the dark forest. At the time, the cheers felt more like screams. Let me explain. I was a 14-year-old girl who loved skateboarding with my best friend. We were small, punky girls who enjoyed exploring and skating. My friend had come over, but everyone at my house was glued to the football game. The whole neighborhood was alive with sounds of people cheering for the Seahawks. Usually, it was a safe, quiet, middle-class neighborhood. It was around 7 or 8 p.m., but by then it was quite dark. Not pitch black, but that deep, dark blue that sticks around until midnight. My friend had brought cigarettes, and we decided to sneak off and skate to the forest nearby to smoke and hang out. The woods were a long strip in the middle of our neighborhood, bordered by steep slopes that led up to people's backyards. Locals called it a greenbelt since it had only one entrance and one exit. It felt like a secluded valley, surrounded by trees and houses high above. All the kids explored it, and hidden trails often led to makeshift forts. We made it to the woods and walked until we found a spot far enough in where adults couldn't see us smoking. At the time, we didn't realize it, but almost every adult was inside watching the Super Bowl. It felt safe there in the dark, laughing and sharing cigarettes, with the cheers from nearby homes echoing around us. We had enough cigarettes to have our own, but we liked sharing one, passing it back and forth. It made us feel cool and connected. We were sharing our second one, and I remember it between my fingers as my friend laughed, trying to grab it. Suddenly, she stopped laughing. Her eyes went wide, and she pointed behind me. "Not gonna work, Jess." I thought, sure, she was trying to make me look away so she could grab the cigarette, but I barely heard her whisper over the cheers echoing through the trees. "I'm not kidding." I turned around, squinting into the dark, and looked up. About 50 feet up the slope, I saw a man standing there, watching us. The woods were almost always empty, except for the occasional kid or teenager, and adults mostly used the area to dump yard clippings. The man was wearing all black, with a beanie pulled over his head and his hands shoved into his pockets. He looked tall, but I couldn't make out his face clearly. I waved at him, wondering how long he had been standing there. It shocked me that he might have been there the entire time. I hoped he was a neighbor, waiting to yell at us for smoking and threatening to tell my parents. But he didn't wave back or make a sound. "Hello," I choked out. The man just stood there, his hands still in his pockets, a faint light from a back porch dimly lighting his figure. I whispered to Jess, "What do we do?" The man pulled his hands out of his pockets, revealing gloved hands, not regular gloves but more like thick winter gloves. He took a single step down the slope, leaves crunching beneath him. Then he stopped, just watching us. More cheers erupted in the distance, but now they felt ominous rather than comforting. "I don't know," I whispered back. "If we scream, no one will hear us. Everyone's yelling right now." Tears started welling up in her eyes, something I'd never seen in our 9 years of friendship. I realized I had to think fast. Then we heard another crunch as he took another step. I yelled, "What do you want from us?" He reached up to pull down what I realized was a ski mask, not just a beanie. I screamed at Jess to run and to grab her skateboard. We jumped up and ran out of the woods, clutching our skateboards. The man began to follow, walking quickly, like in a horror movie. I guess we weren't moving very fast since we each held a skateboard, but once we got out of the woods, it was uphill toward my house. He was about the length of a house behind us, his mask pulled up again. I wanted to ring a neighbor's doorbell or yell for help, but we were terrified that no one would hear us or that they wouldn't be home. We sprinted up the hill, 3 houses away from mine, when the man suddenly stopped. We didn't look back and kept running. We finally made it home, breathing heavily and covered in dirt from the woods. As we tried to catch our breath, my dad appeared, and I expected him to be angry. Instead, he sighed and said, "Well, the Seahawks lost the Super Bowl." Years back, when I was a teenager, my friend Jake and I would often go longboarding late at night. Since my friends and I were all night owls, we loved the freedom of almost never running into anyone else on the roads or trails we frequented. Even on the main roads, it was rare to see a car at that hour in such a remote area, and we'd always spot them from afar thanks to the headlights and the sound of engines breaking the calm of the night. We were really into it back then and would ride our boards for miles, sometimes staying out until the sun came up. One particular night, we decided to head out to a route far from our usual back roads. This one started with a narrow, paved path that separated 2 parts of a long lake. The path would flood when it rained, so we wanted to take advantage of it before it went under again. It was about 2 miles long, and the scenery made for a peaceful ride. After reaching the end of the lake, we decided to keep going and turned onto a nearby path that led into a dense forest preserve. As we came to the first hill, we looked down and saw a faint, moving light in the darkness below. It moved in such a strange way, and it was hard to make out what it was. Instead of shining our flashlight down, we quietly watched it, whispering about what it could be. Suddenly, that tiny light turned into multiple blinding lights, accompanied by loud revving noises, overwhelming our senses that had adjusted to the dark and quiet. Acting purely out of fear, we instantly turned around and ran as fast as we could, with shouting and revving sounds closing in behind us. By some luck, we found a dark, overgrown hole in the side of a hill and hid there, hoping the plants and darkness would shield us from whoever was out there. We watched as our pursuers reached the spot where we'd been. There were 4 men, 2 on ATVs and 2 on large motorcycles. They were shouting to each other about something, but we couldn't hear what they were saying from our hiding spot. Feeling somewhat safe, we whispered to each other, wondering who these guys could be. My first guess was that they might be rangers, though we'd never seen any out here, and we doubted the county even had a budget for patrolling the woods at night. Plus, their vehicles weren't at all suited for the paved paths. The men called out, saying things like, "We know you're out there. Come out." We stayed silent, betting they were bluffing. Then we heard one of them yell, "Find them now!" and heard the crash of a bottle, which dashed any hope we had that these were just rangers. We watched as they split up, each heading down different paths, including the one we'd come from. It felt like we stayed in that dugout forever, frozen with fear, watching the lights travel through the woods. One of them had already circled back to where he'd started. I considered calling for help but didn't dare open my phone, worried that even a sliver of light would give away our location. Finally, when their lights seemed far enough, we found the courage to move. We ran through the woods, occasionally stopping to hide whenever we thought they were close. The woods got thinner as we went, and the hiding spots grew worse, making the fear of being seen even worse. Eventually, we made it out of the woods and reached the intersection of 2 main roads, far from where we'd started. We crouched in a ditch to make a call. I noticed missed calls from another friend, Kevin, who we'd planned to meet up with after our ride. I quickly called him, frantically explaining where we were. Luckily, he hadn't given up on our plans despite us not answering and was only a few miles away. I told him the crossroads we were near, and he said he'd come right away. Jake and I hid until Kevin arrived, which thankfully was before any of those men returned. We jumped into the back seat, telling him to drive off as fast as possible. The relief I felt being safely driven away from there is hard to describe. After we explained what had happened, we decided not to involve the police. thinking the men would be gone by the time any officer arrived and that we'd only get ourselves in trouble for using those paths at such an hour. To this day, I have no clue who those men were. Friends and family have come up with all kinds of theories. Some think we stumbled upon a big drug deal. Jake and I later admitted to each other that, in the moment, our minds immediately went to horror movie killers with chainsaws. Could have ended a lot worse. Whatever those men thought we saw that made them so determined to catch us, we never actually saw. I'm a woman, now 32. Back in 1988, my parents divorced, and by 1989, my dad had settled in St. Louis, Missouri, with my new stepmom. My brother and I would spend every summer break with them, running wild through the woods, chasing animals, and enjoying the freedom that came from parents who worked during the day. Their place was in South County, in an affordable but decent apartment building at the very back of the complex. To the south was a small ravine lined with trees, and just behind Dad's apartment was another complex with a wooded area stretching along the back. That first week, my brother and I met a new friend, Patrick, who lived in the nearby building with his mom. We spent hours exploring the woods together, building forts from leftover wood and raiding Dad's toolbox to find things for our long-standing prank war with the kids in the other building. One day, while scouting for the perfect hideout, we stumbled upon what looked like a poorly built shack. It had pieces of rotting wood nailed together with a torn blue tarp over the top. Signs of a small fire outside made us curious, and being daring kids, I kept watch while my brother and Patrick peeked inside. Inside the tent, they found a pile of damp clothes, a dirty pillow, a rusty pot, a flashlight, a hammer, and food wrappers. At first, we thought it was the coolest discovery of the summer. But as I stood there, I felt uneasy, like someone was watching us. I suggested we should leave, but the boys teased me. Feeling increasingly sick, I finally convinced them to move on by reminding them of our next prank plan for the kids in the other building. We left the shack behind and got caught up in other adventures like playing games, planning pranks, and raiding the fridge. By dark, we said goodbye to Patrick and headed back for dinner. After dinner, my dad and stepmom handed us the remote and went to bed, telling us not to stay up too late. My brother and I were watching TV, with the living room window open, letting in a soft summer breeze. Occasionally, we heard footsteps outside, which we assumed were tenants out for a smoke. Then I went to the kitchen for snacks. As I turned to head back to the living room, my heart stopped. A tall, dark figure was standing at the edge of the woods, looking straight through the window at me. Instinctively, I checked to make sure the front door was locked, then walked over to my brother, whispering, "Remember the shack we found? I think the guy who built it is outside watching us. Don't say anything, act normal. I'll quietly close the windows, and we'll tell Dad tomorrow." My brother, wide-eyed, nodded. Used to handling things together, I knew he trusted me. I crawled around the apartment, shutting all the windows, then carefully closed the living room one from the side so I wouldn't be seen. We decided to pretend to go to bed. My job as the older sibling was to turn off the lights, even though we were scared of the dark. I could still see the man standing outside as I lay down on the couch, praying he couldn't see me. Eventually, I must have drifted off because I woke up hours later to my brother asking if it was safe to get up. I checked the window, saw only trees, and told him it was clear. We rushed to Dad's room and told him everything. He mostly brushed it off but warned us to stay out of those woods. The next day, cautious but unsure, we kept the apartment locked, called Patrick, and told him everything. Once he came over, we took turns watching the window. That afternoon, Patrick's mom came by, worried after hearing our story, and took him home. 30 minutes later, 2 police cars pulled up. Patrick's mom had called them. We watched as 2 officers went into the woods while one stayed behind, asking us questions. About 10 minutes later, 3 officers returned, holding a scruffy man with his head down. As he looked up and glared, I squeezed my brother's hand, telling him the cops would take him to jail. I think I was trying to reassure myself as much as him. I was scared but felt relieved that they had found him and the knife he'd been carrying. We realized then how foolish but lucky we'd been. I grew up in a forested area of Missouri on a short, dead-end road more than 10 miles away from the nearest town. There were just 7 homes in our area, each set on 2.5-acre wooded lots, if not bigger. There were no large wild animals in the area, no bears or other big creatures, and people didn't wander around lost. In the 20 years I lived there, we never saw any lost folks or big animals in the area. When I was a young teen, around 14, I had a close friend named John, a couple of years older than me, who lived next door. John could stay out with his friends much later than I could, and he would sometimes sneak over to my yard after getting home late, tossing small stones at my window to talk. My bed was right next to my window, so I'd open it, and we'd whisper stories and talk quietly for a while. My bedroom was on the 2nd floor, and the window faced the backyard, with John's house off to the side. I could see his house over the low bushes and trees along the path to his driveway. The light near his side entrance usually let me know if he was home. If it was on, he was probably still out, and if it was off, he had likely gone in for the night. One night in the summer, when my window was open, I heard a car pull up in John's driveway around midnight. I was about 14, and I could hear him getting out of the car, chatting with his friends. Once his friends drove away, I softly called out to him, trying not to wake my parents, but he didn't answer. Figuring he didn't hear me, I had a not-so-great idea. I decided to sneak outside and surprise him. I spent a lot of time in the woods, learning to move quietly. As kids, we'd often sneak around trying to spook each other. I slipped out of my room, down the stairs, and out through the back garage door that opened into our backyard below my window. There was a worn path leading to John's house through a gravel area and a short path through the trees, about 25 feet long. My parents had put down gravel around the back of the house since plants didn't grow well in the shade of the large oak trees. There were stepping stones arranged in the gravel, so if you stayed on the stones, you wouldn't make noise on the gravel. I picked my way quietly over the stones, heading toward John's house. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I didn't see him. At that moment, I heard his door close and the light go off, meaning he had gone inside, likely to bed. I stayed still for a bit, thinking I saw something move in the woods between our houses, but not on the path we usually used. If you left the path, you'd end up in wild rose and raspberry bushes with thorns, so it was odd that he'd be off trail. I thought he might be trying to scare me, just as I planned to scare him. But what I saw moving in the trees looked human but strange. It moved slowly, stopping every now and then. It was getting closer, yet it wasn't coming directly toward my window to talk. Thinking it was still John, I crouched down, waiting for a chance to jump out and startle him. The dark outline seemed to be moving carefully, checking every few steps and hiding, which was odd. I grew impatient and whispered for him, but he didn't answer. Tired of waiting, I decided to sneak back inside. I tiptoed back to the garage door and slipped inside, locking up as I went. Once I was back upstairs, I heard someone or something walking around outside in the yard. I whispered out the window for John, but got no response. Then I heard a fall, followed by a soft grunt below my window. It was quiet enough not to wake my parents, but loud enough to give me a jolt. If you've never seen one, a window well is a semicircular hole outside a basement window, about 3 or 4 feet deep, lined with metal. It lets in light for basement windows below ground level. There was no reason John would fall into our window well. We'd played hide and seek and other outdoor games all over the neighborhood since we were young, and we knew the area and the window wells by heart. The noise sounded human, but it wasn't like an animal. Whoever it was pulled themselves out quietly with little noise, and that's when I realized this wasn't a game. I looked out of my window, but the screen prevented me from leaning out to see directly below. Then I heard the crunch of footsteps in the gravel. John knew where the stepping stones were and would never make that kind of noise. He knew my parents were strict, and he was as good at being quiet as I was. Whatever it was stopped, and I held my breath, my face against the screen for what felt like ages. It was probably a half hour, though it felt like an hour, and eventually, I got tired and drifted off to sleep next to my window. A few things I know for sure. It wasn't John. I asked him the next day, and he said he'd gone to bed when he got home. He wouldn't have lied about that. I'm pretty certain it wasn't any of our neighbors either. Only 2 other houses had kids, and all 7 houses in our area were on large, spread-out lots, at least 2.5 acres each. There weren't any big animals nearby, just deer that mostly kept away from houses, and our dog would have scared off any wildlife near our yard. This story took place about 2 years ago. My grandparents own a cabin deep in the woods, and I used to visit it often when I was younger. During winter break, I asked my friends, Jay and Max, if they wanted to come with me to stay at the cabin for a few days. After getting permission from my grandparents, they agreed. We were all excited because we loved the outdoors, and my friends had always wanted to see the cabin. The day we left, my grandparents came along to ensure everything was settled before they said goodbye. After that, it was just me, my friends, and a dog, Buck, a German shepherd named after the novel The Call of the Wild. Buck was a brave dog. I remember how he once stood his ground against a coyote when we lived at my parents' ranch. But something was off about him during this trip. He was quieter than usual, and although not truly scared, I could tell he sensed something strange in the air. By the 4th night, we were outside by the cabin. Max was cooking on the barbecue, and Jay and I were chatting about school while Buck was digging near us. Suddenly, he began barking wildly at the trees, like he was completely losing it. It was so intense you'd think he was rabid. We rushed over to him and saw what he was barking at. A dark shape standing at the edge of the tree line. At first, I thought it was a person, but as I focused on it, I realized it wasn't shaped like a human at all. It was standing on 2 legs, but its legs bent like a canine's. The head resembled that of a wolf or coyote, with thick black fur covering its body. Its yellow eyes pierced through the night, and its ears were pointed, just like a wolf's. What made it even stranger was that it had human-like hands with claws that looked sharper than a bear's. It must have been about 7 feet tall, with muscles that were clearly defined, though it was lean. When I gasped in shock, I think it heard me, because it turned its gaze directly at me as if it were trying to peer into my soul. Buck, who had probably seen it as well, started barking even louder. Then the creature barked back. I swear, its bark was so deep and terrifying, it made Buck stop for a second. After a tense moment, Buck continued barking, and the creature responded again. But then, it made a sound that sent a chill down my spine. Half a dog's bark, half a human scream, mixed with a wolf's howl. Buck froze, whimpering and hiding behind me. We stood there in stunned silence until Max, almost whispering to himself, said, "What the heck is that?" The creature seemed to hear it, as its ears twitched, and after a long moment, it turned and walked away. What made it so unnerving was how it walked. It moved like a person, swinging its arms and taking long strides as it disappeared into the woods. That was enough for us. We ran back inside the cabin and stayed there, not saying much. Buck, who had never been afraid before, was on edge from then on. He refused to go outside day or night. At first, we tried to come up with logical explanations. Maybe it was a bear or a mountain lion or even a wolf. Then we started to consider crazier ideas like Sasquatch. I didn't remember if it had been a full moon that night, so I figured it couldn't have been a werewolf. But even after we left, Buck didn't act the same. He stuck close to me and refused to visit my parents' ranch, where there were woods around their property too. I don't know what that creature said to him, but I'm certain it wasn't anything good, because Buck has never been the same since. A few months back, I had an unsettling experience involving my young son, and it's the way it ended that still bothers me. I apologize for going into so much detail, but I feel it's important to give a full and clear picture of that day. To provide some context, my husband and I are both in our mid-20s, and we have 2 children. Lee, a boy, and Lynn, our 6-year-old girl. The differences between the two have been fascinating to see. Lynn is becoming more independent, while Lee is still very attached to me. He spent most of his early years during the lockdowns, which brought about its own challenges that we're working on now. Lee started learning to walk around the time the lockdowns began, and he was desperate to get outside and explore. It was hard seeing him so eager to do something he was essentially kept from doing, and it was difficult explaining it to someone so young. That's why I was so relieved when things finally started to open up. My husband and I had a lot to catch up on, and it was a year before we could finally take some time off as a family. In early June, we decided to spend a weekend away. Lee would finally be able to explore the world like he'd been wanting to. We packed up the car and drove out to a local nature preserve. It spans 50 square miles of forests and hiking trails, and it was a perfect day, sunny with clear skies. Lee was clearly thrilled, and I hoped a few hours of running around in the woods would give him the exercise he needed. We followed the marked trails, with my husband leading the way. Along the way, Lynn tripped and scraped her knee. It wasn't a big deal, but she handled it well, and I was proud to see her being so tough. While I was tending to her, Lee wandered off into the woods without us realizing. Took a couple of minutes before we noticed, and I didn't handle it well. Panic set in as visions of dangerous animals filled my mind, even though there weren't any bears around. My husband, calm as ever, suggested we start searching, reminding me that Lee, being only 4, couldn't have gotten very far. I took Lynn with me and retraced our steps down the trail, while my husband, who was more familiar with the woods, searched the area. The longer the search went on, the more frantic I became. Lynn started crying because she was scared, and that snapped me back to reality. I took a deep breath and reassured her that everything would be fine. It was as much to calm myself as it was to comfort her. Just then, I heard someone call out from the trail. I looked up and saw a woman standing with Lee holding his hand. The relief I felt was overwhelming. I ran to him, tears streaming down my face. He had a big grin on his face, clearly unaware of how serious the situation had been. I wiped my eyes and reached for him. He jogged toward me with his little legs, and I hugged him tightly, probably too tightly. I thanked the woman and asked where she had found him. She explained that she had been walking up the trail and had noticed him alone coming out of the woods. When he saw her, he walked right up to her, and all she had to do was extend her hand, and he took it. She said he seemed very comfortable with her, which put me at ease, but also left me confused. Once we got home, though, her words began to bother me, and that's where my problem lies. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm incredibly grateful for her help. I would give anything to get one of my children back if something were to happen to them. But what troubles me is how easily she was able to get Lee to walk off with her. It's unsettling to think how an ill-intentioned person could use that same approach. I can't help but wonder how many times something like that could have happened, and it's been eating at me ever since. I've tried to let it go, but the worry keeps coming back. I wish I could sit down and explain the risks to him, but he's at an age where I'm not sure he'd understand the full scope of it. I don't want to scare him or make him afraid of people, but I do worry that if I'm too direct, it could make him anxious and hinder his ability to form friendships as he grows up. Times are tough for kids these days, and I don't want to make it harder for him. So here I am, my mind going in a million directions, and I'm open to any advice. The ball is in your court. What do you think I should do? My involvement in this story began when I was 10. It was my first time hunting deer with my father and uncle. When my uncle spotted a set of tracks, I became fascinated. He noticed my interest and encouraged it, as he was a skilled tracker, and he shared his knowledge with me. I supplemented his lessons with books. Over time, nature became my refuge and the wildlife my family. My desire to hunt lessened, and I used the skills I had learned to guide those who hadn't developed them. I don't oppose hunting. It's a natural part of life, and let's not forget, we're part of that cycle. After finishing school, I set out on my own to explore things beyond what was written in books or known to most. My work as a guide kept me fed, but it was my quest for knowledge that truly fulfilled me. Eventually, I became restless with that line of work and sought a new challenge. A position with a search and rescue team opened up, and I applied. I was hired right away. Our team was near a national park, a state park, and vast public lands, and although I was a fairly experienced tracker by then, I didn't start out exclusively tracking people. It was a bit like tracking animals, but it had its own difficulties that I had yet to perfect. You never really do. My job was to follow our team leader and absorb everything he taught me. He was calm and patient, and I learned a lot from him. I took part in many operations before I finally had the chance to lead a team. It wouldn't be with my group, though, because a neighboring state had an urgent need for help, and I was tasked with leading a team to locate a missing hiker. He had been missing for nearly a week, and the weather was expected to worsen. I arrived the next day and got to work immediately. The situation was far from ideal. The hiker had a 4-day head start, and the area had already been disturbed by many people. We spent most of the morning looking for fresh tracks. Just before lunch, I found some and began the search. Everything about the trail seemed to match the description I had been given: boot size, weight. But as we got closer to the objective, I began noticing small inconsistencies. I tried to chalk them up to fatigue and kept going. By late afternoon, I spotted a small tent atop a hill. I radioed in, announcing that we had found the missing hiker. A wave of satisfaction washed over me, but it didn't last long. When we called out to the tent, a well-groomed young man stepped out, looking far too fresh. My team reassured him, telling him he was safe, but he looked confused. "What do you mean? I just got here this morning. Did someone report me missing?" he asked. That was when I understood why nothing had added up. I asked him his name, and it didn't match what was on my paperwork. To be sure, I looked around at his belongings, and although some things were similar, there were noticeable differences. A more experienced tracker should have caught those. The satisfaction I had felt vanished, replaced by shame. I couldn't look my team in the eye. I called in to admit my mistake, and I could hear the displeasure in our leader's voice. "So, what you're telling me is that the real missing person is still out there for another night?" he asked. I felt a wave of fear and guilt. Because of my error, this man would have to spend another night alone in the woods, and with a snowstorm on the way, his chances of surviving were slim. I couldn't face my team after that. I wanted to quit and walk away, but a life was at stake. I sent my team back to camp and stayed behind to search on my own. The next morning, I was back on the trail. My mistake was clearer now, as was my arrogance. I had ignored where one trail split, and I hadn't followed the signs. The lost hiker had been on the same path just the day before, but had veered off in another direction. I had ignored my instincts, too eager and too confident. By late morning, I could tell the hiker was in serious trouble. The dragging steps he had left behind said it all. When I finally reached the end of the trail, it was worse than I feared. The man was crawling on all fours, weak and delirious. Up ahead, I saw a mound of bright clothing. It had to be him. I rushed up to check his condition, but when I touched him, his skin was cold. I immediately radioed for my team, and within minutes, they arrived. We all knew he was gone, but the paramedics tried to revive him anyway. I could only sit there, my hands over my face. This was my first time leading a team, and because of my arrogance, a man was dead. I thought about quitting, leaving for good, because no one would ever trust me again. I felt like I had let everyone down, especially my mentor. I considered calling him to apologize, but I figured he'd hang up on me. Why would he want to hear from me after such a failure? So I was stunned when he called me. He asked why I hadn't contacted anyone, and I was confused. Haven't you heard? I messed up badly. A man's dead because of it, I said. Tell Mark I'm not coming back. I'm a liability. His response shocked me. He sighed and said, so what if you made a mistake? We all screw up. I messed up just yesterday. You're not the first and you won't be the last. We all make mistakes. You know we depend on each other. Are you really willing to walk away from this knowing what we stand for? Get it together and come back to work. If you want to quit, you can tell Mark in person. I expected more from you. I was speechless. No one had criticized me like that. I had been punishing myself, but maybe I was just overreacting. I managed to mumble an okay and hung up. I felt like a child being scolded by a parent. I did as he said and showed up at the station the next day. Everyone was there for a training session. Mark noticed me and asked if I was joining. I didn't sense any anger or distrust from him. Though hesitant, I sat down at one of the tables. The class continued like any other, and every day since then has been a valuable experience. Not once has anyone mentioned my mistake, not even my mentor. We never discussed that phone call. Maybe there was no need to. I still feel bad about not finding that man, but I know we did everything we could, and we wouldn't have been able to let him rest in peace without at least trying. Finding yourself alone in an unfamiliar place can be terrifying, especially for a child. Now imagine it's a vast forest, and you have no clue where you are. That's what happened to me when I was 8. Our family was on vacation in the Adirondacks in upstate New York. I vividly remember how amazed I was by all the trees, being from a desert area where such greenery was rare. As an adult, I understand that forests are common, but they were a novelty for me back then. At the time, I was only 8 with limited life experiences. The mood of the trip had already felt off, even before I got lost. Although I didn't know it yet, my parents' separation was just a year away. I could sense that something was wrong. There was an underlying tension throughout the entire vacation. My brother, who was only 2 years older than me, was unusually quiet and well-behaved. Every time I tried to pick a fight with him, he ignored me. It made for a long, dull trip. I went a little wild when we reached Lake Placid, our second day there. We visited an amusement park called Mountain Springs, which was similar to places like Six Flags. I wore my parents out, begging to go on every ride, even the ones I wasn't tall enough for. I threw fits every time I was told no. Looking back, I was a real brat. The following day, we headed to a nearby campground where my parents had planned to stay for a few days. Camping was a completely new experience for me, and I couldn't understand why anyone would choose to do it. I spent the whole first day asking a million questions. I demanded answers immediately and couldn't wait to know everything. I'm sure it was exhausting for my parents. I later wondered if I was the reason their marriage fell apart. Was it my fault my dad left? At the time, I didn't care about anything but myself and my desires. Things took a turn the next day. Sleeping in a tent turned out to be the coolest thing in the world. It was a complete change of heart from the day before. Suddenly, I wanted to live this way forever. My dad had to practically drag me away from the campfire when it was time to go to bed. And little did I know, that moment would spark a future fascination. But at the time, I was just eager to explore the woods around me. After breakfast, the whole family went for a hike by the lake. Every few steps, I would stop to examine something new. I wasn't concerned about keeping up or anything else. My dad tried his best to keep me in line, but as any parent knows, kids have a knack for disappearing. That's exactly what happened to me. One time, I stopped to look at something, and before I knew it, I had wandered off the trail. I have no idea how long I walked, but at some point my stomach growled. I paused and called out for a snack. That's when I realized I was completely alone. I looked around, but every tree and fern looked the same. I figured I couldn't be far from the trail. I called out for my mom, then my dad, but no one answered. A sick feeling began to creep into my stomach. At first, I wasn't that scared, thinking they'd find me any minute. But I walked on, searching for something familiar. The hours passed, and as the sun began to set, my unease grew into full-blown panic. I ran from tree to tree, screaming for help. Just before dark, I spotted a trail in the distance. I saw a figure in the distance and screamed, hoping it was someone who could help. When the figure turned toward me and hurried toward me, I wondered if there was some kind of monster coming to get me. My instinct told me to run, but then I heard my dad's voice calling my name. Couldn't believe it. I dropped to the ground, crying with relief. He scooped me up, and I'll never forget how safe I felt in his arms. That moment was the best feeling I'd ever experienced, at least until my own daughter was born. We returned to the camp, and my mom hugged me until I could barely breathe. A bunch of uniformed people were standing around, and a paramedic even checked me over. I was so exhausted that I fell asleep in my parents' tent and didn't wake up until it was time to pack up the next morning. After my little adventure, my parents decided they'd had enough of relaxing. We packed everything into the car and headed home. 2 days later, we were back in Phoenix, and everything seemed right in the world again. I quickly forgot about the whole ordeal. As I mentioned, my parents divorced the following year, and that marked the end of our family vacations. I went camping with a few friends over the next few years, and by then I was old enough to understand things better. I'm 27 now, and though I've grown older, I still think about that day. Every time I find myself alone in an unfamiliar place, I'm reminded of what happened in that forest. Some things, no matter how small, stick with us forever. One summer, while I was living and working around the Chicago area, I experienced some very odd things. I'm no expert on ghosts or the paranormal, so I'll just share what happened, and you can decide for yourself. Soon after starting my new job, I met a great guy named Paul, and we hit it off. One day, he suggested we go hiking. Originally, I'm from Russia, so spending time in forests is nothing new to me, and I was excited. As we were hiking, it started to rain harder than I'd ever seen. We ventured further and further into the woods, eventually leaving any trails behind and wading through swampy areas. We were busy talking and getting to know each other, not paying much attention to where we were. We hadn't seen anyone for a while, given how deep we were and the heavy rain. Then we came across an old teepee frame, just the wooden structure. We thought it was interesting and kept going that way. Suddenly, we both heard a baby crying. In the forest, animals sometimes make sounds like that, so we figured it was a fawn or something. The cry seemed far off at first, so we ignored it. But within seconds, the sound was right next to us. It was so close and loud that it could have been a few feet away. But when we looked around, even up in the trees, we saw nothing. The situation felt strange, so we quickly walked in the other direction. As soon as we paused, the crying sound started up again, as if urging us to leave. We took off, nearly running back to the trailhead, relying on Google Maps and our memory to navigate. Once out, We agreed it was unsettling and started looking up information about the area. Websites on haunted forests in Illinois popped up, and it turned out the place was on Native American burial grounds. We put the whole incident out of our minds until one night after work, when Paul told me he couldn't stop thinking about it and wanted to return to the spot. I thought it was a bad idea, especially since it was dark out, but his friend Ryan wanted to join too, and I figured I'd tag along to keep an eye on them. We drove there, arriving around 11 p.m. after a missed turn. Once we got to the forest entrance, we headed in with flashlights, but visibility was poor. We crossed a small bridge leading to a deeper part of the woods. As soon as we crossed, I felt uneasy, like we were intruding on something. Ryan, who'd been confidently leading the way, suddenly stopped on the other side of the bridge, and we were all hit with a strong feeling of dread. I've spent time in forests, day and night, but I'd never felt anything like this. We exchanged nervous looks, and then heard something crunching toward us in the dark. Ryan, who had seemed unfazed a moment before, looked anxious and said, "Maybe we should head back." We all turned around and started walking briskly toward the bridge, only relaxing once we were on the other side. When we got back to the road where our car was parked, we noticed a young woman, maybe in her early 20s, walking along the highway. She looked indigenous or possibly of Asian or Hispanic descent and was wearing very little clothing. Her walk seemed strange, like she was almost vibrating, though she wasn't stumbling like someone who'd been drinking. There wasn't a building in sight, which felt odd. My stepdad is Malaysian and has told me stories about spirits that appear on roadsides, but I didn't want to leave her alone, ghost or not. I convinced Paul to slow down and I called out, asking if she needed help. She turned slowly, a strange smile spreading across her face, and nodded. I felt that same unsettling feeling from the forest, but decided to help her anyway. She got in the back seat right behind me next to Ryan. Ryan started chatting with her, asking where she was from, but the whole time, she kept her gaze fixed on me, smiling slowly. It was eerie, and I felt uneasy, as if something bad would happen if I looked away. Ryan asked her if she'd come from a bar, and she nodded, though there were none nearby. She gave an address about 15 minutes away, and while we drove, her smile never faded, and I felt the dread building up. When we finally got to her street, I turned around to check one last time, and she was gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept picturing her smiling face in the dark, almost as if it was waiting for me. Many of us have been there. You're on a trip, riding in the car with your boyfriend, and he does or says something that gets under your skin. Maybe he accidentally calls you by his ex's name. You lose it and demand he pull over right then and there. He tries to fix things, but you're not having it. Eventually, he pulls over, and you get out, starting to walk down the road. Do you have a destination in mind? Did you think about how cold it might be outside? No, he didn't. And now you're stuck on some unfamiliar road, freezing, while your pride won't let you turn back. In most cases, cooler heads would take over, and the mistake would be forgotten. But there are times when things don't go that way. These are the moments when bad things often happen. I'm going to share my own story of when things went wrong, hoping it shows how important it is to think before acting. This happened when I was 20. I was dating a guy who was a year older than me and went to the same college. He had his own apartment, and one evening, we were coming back from a movie when he made the unforgivable mistake of laughing at my makeup. I was devastated, just like in the earlier scenario. I snapped and demanded he pull over. I needed to be anywhere but in that car with him. He tried to calm me down, but that only made it worse. I started yelling again and demanded that he let me out. I even tried to jump out while the car was still moving. He saw this and finally pulled over, cursing under his breath. The car stopped, and I got out, leaving my sweater and jacket behind. After walking a few steps, I heard the car creeping up behind me. I ignored it and kept walking. He began calling my name and begging me to come back. The more desperate he sounded, the more I kept going. He eventually ran up and tried to grab me, but I was in full fight or flight mode and ran into the nearby woods. I thought he would follow me, but he didn't. The last thing I heard him shout was something like, "If you think I'm waiting all night for you to come out, you're wrong." Which, looking back, made a lot of sense. I heard his tires screech off in the distance and then complete silence. Now I was alone in the woods in the dark, with no flashlight and no idea where I was. I had run so far that I couldn't even hear the road anymore. The cold was really starting to set in, and that's when his little joke started to feel a lot more serious. It was well past midnight, and I was stranded in the woods with the temperature dropping fast. That's when I realized how bad my situation really was. I kept walking for about an hour when I heard the howl of coyotes in the distance. At the time, I thought they were wolves, not knowing anything about coyotes. I can laugh about it now, but back then I was terrified. Imagine being all alone, in the dark, with a pack of predators out there. I turned around and ran the other way, convinced they were chasing me. If they actually were, running away was the worst thing I could have done. I couldn't even count how many times tree branches scraped across my face and arms. Eventually, I had to stop because I was so exhausted. The howls were far behind now, but I was too tired to keep going. If I was going to die, I prayed it would be quick. Looking back, the coyotes probably didn't even know I was there. But that didn't help me at the time. The cold was unbearable, and I couldn't stop shaking. I thought about starting a fire, but realized I had no way to do that. I kept moving as best as I could, but soon my body started giving out. I was at the point where I thought I might die if I stopped, but I was too tired to care. I was just about to give up when I stumbled upon a gravel road. It was like a second wind hit me. I knew it had to lead to a main road, so I picked a direction and kept walking. After a while, I realized I was almost jogging. About half an hour into the walk, I thought I heard cars in the distance, and I broke into a run. When I turned a corner, I finally saw the highway. I kept following the road south until I reached a 24-hour gas station. I called a friend to come pick me up, and we stopped at a diner on the way home. It was there that I saw my first sunrise, and it was one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. After a long, restful sleep, I called my boyfriend and ended things. From his reaction, it was clear he was relieved. Our relationship had been filled with constant drama, and it was clear we weren't meant to be together. I was back on the market, but I didn't rush into a new relationship. Instead, I took some time to figure out what I really wanted from a partner. That brief night in the woods showed me how much I needed to mature. When I did start dating again, I made sure to avoid guys who acted immature. If both partners behave like children, the drama will never end. It seemed like the right approach because less than a year later, I met my husband by chance at a bookstore. He's the definition of chill, and his calm energy has rubbed off on me, especially when I look back on that night. And that's my story. I hope it helps someone think twice before acting on impulse. When I was young, around second grade, my family moved out to a secluded area in rural Mississippi. There were no other kids nearby, so I often felt quite lonely, which wasn't surprising. During the time we were getting settled, my parents had a large mobile home, and one experience during this period took years for me to fully process. One day, when we were visiting the plot where the mobile home would eventually sit, my mom needed to stop and use a restroom. With no gas station for at least 10 miles, my dad turned down a dirt road, hoping to find a private spot. Around 200 or 300 yards from the main road, we came across what looked like an abandoned gym, maybe from an old school. My dad decided this would be a place for my mom to go. We went inside, and while I don't remember much about the place, one detail sticks in my mind. Near the entrance was a huge mound of old clothes. After my dad finished his business, He paused in front of that pile, looking up at it thoughtfully, though he didn't say a word about it. Several weeks later, after the mobile home was set up, we moved in, and I pretty much forgot about the gym. But strange things started happening. They weren't strange in a way you'd expect, like objects moving on their own, but still odd. Within a month or so of living there, I was on the front porch playing with some toys when I heard children laughing. Now, to give some context, our mobile home was about 100 feet back from a dirt road, and across the road lived an elderly man I'll call Tom. Behind Tom's house was a large stretch of pine trees extending all the way to the two-lane highway, about 500 to 600 feet from where I was playing. As I sat on the porch, I kept hearing laughter. Not just one child, but what sounded like several kids, maybe 5 or 6, laughing and playing somewhere behind Tom's place. Since I didn't have friends nearby, I was curious and wondered if these kids would play with me. I walked up to the road, trying to figure out where they were, and it seemed like they were playing in the woods, with their laughter drifting on and off. After a bit, I called out that I wanted to play, too, and as soon as I said it, the laughter stopped. 1 second there was cheerful noise, and then total silence, as if you could hear a pin drop. I figured I'd scared them off and went back inside. This happened several more times. I'd hear the kids laughing, but they never came closer. After it happened a few times, I mentioned it to my mom. She got an odd expression on her face and told me she didn't want me playing on the front porch anymore. We stayed in that house for about 2 more years before moving, and I mostly forgot about the experience. It wasn't until years later that the story came up in a conversation with my parents, which is when I learned more. My mom told me her reaction back then was because she'd heard rumors that the area was haunted. She didn't have all the details, but felt it was related to the old gym. All she could say was that something bad had happened there, and it made her uneasy. After both my parents passed away, the memory stuck with me as an unexplained, strange experience. Then one night, feeling nostalgic, I stumbled across a website for the church we'd attended back then. On a whim, I sent an email to the pastor, asking if he knew anything about a gym near where we'd lived. I didn't expect a reply, but a couple of months later, I checked my email and found a response. The pastor told me that, yes, there had once been a gym close to where I remembered. It was part of a private school that had operated there from around 1900 until the late 1970s. Early that spring, a tornado had hit, collapsing one wing of the school and tragically trapping a group of students beneath the debris. Between 10 and 15 children lost their lives in the disaster, and soon after, the school was permanently closed. They'd piled clothing from lockers and other belongings in the gym, which was the pile I remembered. They'd hoped to let a local church use the building, but given what had happened, it was abandoned. The land behind Tom's house had once been part of the school's property, used by students as a playground. That would explain why Tom sometimes dug up old toys, mostly metal trucks, which he'd give to me. Looking back, I now believe that what I'd been hearing was somehow connected to the old school and the tragedy that had occurred. Of course, it's possible that it was just my young imagination, but whatever the case, I thought you'd find the story interesting. My family has a cabin in British Columbia that my great-grandparents originally built, and it's where we spend part of our summers. Our family is big, so we always have to plan in advance who gets which weeks. About 9 years ago, my uncle had a new girlfriend, who later became my favorite aunt, Carrie. We decided to travel there together, and around 8 p.m. we finally arrived. The sun was setting, and there was a heavy feeling in the air. I figured we were all just worn out from the 9-hour drive. We started unloading bags and coolers from the cars and putting them on the front deck. Since Carrie was new to the family, she wanted to make a good impression, so she volunteered to bring everything inside on her own. She went in and stayed there for several minutes before returning with a strange expression. She approached Nana and mentioned something about seeing another relative in the cabin, even though she thought our group was supposed to be the only one staying there that week. Now, my grandpa has a troubled sister who sometimes stays in the cabin when it's empty. Nana immediately got annoyed and asked Grandpa, "For heaven's sake, Bill, is Sylvia here again?" But then Carrie said she didn't think it was Grandpa's sister unless she'd aged about 20 years. At that, Nana looked puzzled and decided to go inside to check. I tagged along behind her, curious as ever. She checked the upstairs, while I stayed on the main floor and bumped into my uncle, who had just finished using the bathroom. Carrie came back inside, and he mentioned that he'd heard her talking to someone and asked who it was. She replied, "Oh, I ran into a lady in that room over there." She pointed to the bedroom that used to belong to my great-grandmother before she passed. At this point, none of us had quite caught on to what was happening until Nana came back downstairs and said no one was there. I felt a chill, and I could see that Carrie and my uncle felt it too. We continued unpacking, and Carrie started carrying her things upstairs but stopped on the staircase, dropping her bags. My uncle asked if she was all right, and she could barely speak as she pointed to a picture on the wall. She said, "That's her. That's the lady I saw." The picture was of my great-grandparents, and there was a small plaque with their names on it. My uncle, ever the skeptic, responded, "Nice try, but no way. That's my grandmother, May. She passed away 6 years ago." Carrie looked at him, Nana, and me with a look of pure shock, and we all believed her. She swore she'd come in, dropped Nana's things in the room, and had seen an older woman by the window. She had apologized for entering and said it was nice to meet her, and the woman smiled before turning back to the window. Carrie even described what she wore: a green velvet sweater with beads arranged in an AZ design on the front, my great-grandmother's favorite sweater. We all felt chills and told the rest of the family what had happened. Even my grandpa, who's a skeptical, no-nonsense type, looked unnerved when he heard that Carrie might have seen his mother. Carrie isn't the only one in our family who has witnessed something unusual in that room. I had a similar experience one night. Everyone else was gathered around a fire outside, and I went in to grab marshmallows. To get to the kitchen from the back door, you have to pass that same bedroom. As I walked by, I distinctly heard a conversation coming from inside, though everyone was still outside. The closer I got to the door, the fainter the voices grew until they faded entirely. This was after what happened with Carrie, so I just poked my head around the corner and said, "Good night, Nana May." Then I grabbed the marshmallows and went back outside. I have a lot of stories about that cabin, many of them not as lighthearted as this encounter with my great-grandmother's spirit. Maybe I'll share more someday. I have plenty. I was on a week-long family vacation when I received a call from the police. An officer informed me that my father's car had been found abandoned on a remote back road at the edge of the county. I was in a panic, as anyone would be, so we cut our trip short and rushed home. I had to wait until I met with the police to learn the full details. A deputy had been on his regular patrol when he came across a car parked oddly at the side of the road, with the driver's side door wide open. Upon approaching, he noticed the engine was still running, but there was no sign of anyone in the car. As per procedure, the deputy ran the license plate, and it came back to my father. This started the missing persons investigation. When I arrived back, my father was still missing, and no one had reported seeing him. Despite the concern, I wasn't overly afraid. There was no indication he'd been harmed. The prevailing theory was that he might have wandered into the woods and got lost, though my father was an experienced woodsman and hunter. I had no doubt he'd show up when he was ready. During the search, my husband and I shared photos and details of my father's disappearance on social media. 3 days passed before a tip came in. A woman was hanging laundry when she saw an older man walking through the woods nearby. She described him as looking confused and disoriented. She ran inside to call the sheriff, but when she returned, he had vanished. Her information led a group of volunteers to find my father hitchhiking 5 miles away from where he had disappeared. We rushed to the location, and this was when I first knew something was wrong. Just as the woman had described, my father looked confused and unwell. He was also severely dehydrated and exhausted, which I assumed was the reason he was sent to the hospital. I stayed by his side that night. The next morning, he was feeling better, but something still wasn't right. I spoke to the doctor about my concerns, and he ordered some cognitive tests. That afternoon, my father was discharged, and we decided to keep him with us until the results came in, so we could better understand his condition. When the tests were done, the results were worse than I expected. The neurologist noted several signs of cognitive decline. My father struggled to answer simple questions that someone his age would normally have no trouble with. During his time staying with us, I saw the effects firsthand. His memory seemed to deteriorate throughout the day, something that could be partly due to fatigue, but there was a noticeable difference compared to just 6 months ago. It was hard to see someone once so sharp lose their edge. The last month has been especially tough for our family. Currently, my father is back at his own home. He no longer has access to his car, and I'm not sure if he misses it. My husband and I are conflicted about whether to place him in a care facility where he can get the help he needs as his condition worsens, or to bring him to live with us. I'm not trained to care for him, and I don't have the strength to assist him with daily tasks like personal hygiene. The thought of him being in a facility surrounded by strangers, slipping away from us, seems even harder to bear. In times like these, I'm reminded of how fortunate I am to have a supportive family. We haven't made any decisions yet, but time is running out, and we need to decide soon. I would appreciate any suggestions, and we'd be grateful for your prayers. Thank you for listening. There was no way to tell how long I'd been running. At least 10 minutes, no more than 20. Either way, it was further and faster than I'd ever run before. When you're running for your life, your body can push itself far beyond what you'd ever think possible. I shouldn't have stopped, but the pain in my legs was unbearable, and he could have been right behind me. He may not have gone more than 100 yards, but I wasn't ready to find out. I saw him, his gun. The clip must have held 40 to 50 bullets, and that had to be enough to turn me into dust. No one would ever recognize me, and maybe that's what he was counting on. I had no choice but to keep going. I could die at any moment, but if I could just find a road or a park employee, maybe I'd make it. I dared to stop for just a moment to catch my breath and kept going until nightfall. Only then did I feel safe enough to stop. The night was warm, and starting a fire would have been a bad idea anyway. But with nothing to wrap up in except the fleece in my pack, I zipped it up all the way and pulled the hood tightly over my head. A decaying log lay nearby with a large hollow space in the back, so I curled up there and fell asleep quickly. I woke once or twice but quickly drifted off again. By dawn, I continued my search. It was less of a search now. Unless my pursuer showed himself, I had to assume he had given up. The chill in my body soon faded with the exertion, and for now, water was plentiful. Hunger, however, was becoming a real enemy. I had never gone more than one night without eating, and it had been over 24 hours. Starving wasn't a death I wanted to face. It was a slow, miserable end, lacking any romanticism. Maybe the gun would have been a better option, I thought to myself, but neither of us would meet our end that day. As the sun climbed high above, I stumbled upon a road, the same road I had entered 3 days before, and soon my suffering ended. A group of men working on fire prevention found me, and they took me to the main ranger station. I recounted the entire ordeal, and that's when their official search began. To properly explain how I ended up there, I must start 3 days before. For most of my adult life, I lived near a famous national park in the US, but it had never appealed to me until I went through a rough breakup. I thought the isolation would give me the peace I needed. Late on a Friday afternoon, I arrived at the park. I set up camp before dusk and spent the evening relaxing with a beer by the fire. I used this time to plan my hike for the next day. The quiet was soothing, and sleep came easily, something I hadn't experienced in weeks. I didn't stir until 8 a.m. After a small breakfast of oatmeal, I packed a small bag for my hike. I was heading to a spot 5 miles ahead, situated above a pasture where wild animals often grazed. I planned to have a quick lunch and enjoy the views before heading back to camp before nightfall. The first part of the hike went well, but at some point, I took a wrong turn and got lost. I didn't realize it for a while, but once I did, panic set in. Hours passed, and I seemed to get deeper and deeper into the woods. Around 3 p.m., I heard voices in the distance, so I started running toward them. I tripped and fell over a hose of some sort, but I wasn't hurt. As I stood up and dusted myself off, a man walked up behind me. He spoke with a heavy accent, and I explained my situation and asked for help. Another man appeared, carrying an assault rifle, which made me nervous. He seemed nervous, too. The two men started talking, and it seemed like they were arguing about something. Neither of them took their eyes off me. Just then, a third man arrived, unarmed and seemed to be in charge. He spoke to both men in a gruff and confident manner. When he finished, he pointed at me. The man with the rifle said, "Okay," and frowned. All three of them stepped back a few paces. The armed man aimed the rifle at me and pulled something back. The handle slammed with great force, and even though I didn't know much about firearms, I had a good idea of what was coming. A sick feeling rose in my stomach. My heart pounded. I had to run, but I didn't know where. As he raised the gun to his shoulder, I took my chance and fled blindly. Branches and vines tore at my face and arms. Every second, I expected a bullet to hit me. A few zips and cracks sounded nearby, and within moments, my legs ached from the effort, my lungs burning as I fought for air. I wasn't sure how much more I could take, but I knew that stopping meant death. Going back meant death. My only options were death. The rest, The Rangers contacted several outside agencies to help with the search. Took 2 weeks before an FBI agent reached out. I answered his questions and asked if there was any news. He was vague, but from what I gathered, the men had escaped capture. He assured me there was no immediate danger to the public, as long as people stuck to marked trails. I will never return to that place. That's all I know. I have some theories, such as illegal marijuana farms, but I can't be sure. I feared the men would hunt me down at my home, but that concern turned out to be unfounded. PTSD is common for those who've been through such encounters, and I thought I'd experience it. Yet, it's been 17 years and I'm mostly the same. Thankfully, I feel fine. The experience, though harrowing, was a lesson. In hindsight, the problems I had at that time seem trivial. In that sense, I guess my escape to the woods did serve its purpose. A strange event happened last year that has stuck with me ever since a coworker suggested I share it here, using an anonymous name, of course. I wasn't familiar with Reddit, so I did some research and found the subreddit. I think you'll enjoy it as it has all the eerie elements readers seem to love, and, best of all, unlike most stories here, this one is actually true. After high school, I had no idea what I wanted to do. With few options, I joined the Navy, eventually becoming a corpsman attached to a Marine unit in Afghanistan. Once my time in the service ended, I went to school to earn my EMT certification and later my paramedic one. While in college, I met an incredible woman and we started dating. Not long after, we moved in together, and it seemed like I was on track to becoming a devoted father and husband, just like my father had been. But that wasn't meant to be. Time passed quickly, and after 3 years, nothing I had hoped for had happened. My relationship fell apart, leaving me heartbroken. Not the success story I had envisioned. While I worked, I could focus, but my free time was difficult. I needed a distraction. After thinking it over, I found a local volunteer search and rescue organization. I reached out to them and they were happy to have me. In many ways, it was similar to the military, going into the wilderness to help people in need. I liked it so much, I hoped to make it a full-time career when the chance came. I hadn't thought about my ex in months, but that's enough about me. Let's get to why I'm here. It's not uncommon for people to report encounters with individuals acting strangely. This can range from a confused hiker to something more concerning, as in this case. I was at home one day when I received a call from my supervisor. A sheriff's deputy had received a report from a woman who had been walking her dog on some public land. She had encountered a young man on the trail. At first, he seemed normal, but as they talked, he became more detached from reality. He claimed he was being chased by a group of men and had been running from them for over 100 miles. He seemed genuinely terrified. The woman noticed that he was wearing a backpack and expensive, clean outdoor gear. She didn't think he was homeless or intoxicated. Feeling sympathy for him, she tried to get him to come with her to the sheriff's office. But when she turned her back, he disappeared. She immediately reported it to the sheriff. The deputy knew we had the expertise for this kind of situation and hoped we could track him down before anything serious happened. The search didn't begin until the next morning, but we quickly picked up his trail. It didn't look like he had been struggling, and it didn't take long to catch up with him. Unfortunately, the outcome wasn't what I'd hoped for. He had ended his life sometime during the night. The trail led to a sheer drop of over 1,000 feet. We recovered his body, and the search was effectively over. I went back to the top to retrieve a few of his personal belongings that had been dropped. One of our trackers, who I'll call Jack, was kneeling a few yards away, staring intently at something and mumbling to himself. He saw me and called me over. He pointed to the ground and asked me what I saw. At first, nothing stood out to me, but after a moment, something caught my attention. The dried dirt in the area looked as though it had been swept with a broom or tree branch. I then noticed that the edge of a boot print was partially erased. Only the heel remained. Jack got up and walked over to a small tree with a broken stump. He pointed at it and I nodded, recognizing it. I searched for the freshly broken limb and soon found it. It had been carelessly tossed into the bushes. Jack then led me to the cliff's edge. We stood there and looked back at the trail. Now in the daylight, we could see the sweeping marks leading up to the edge, where the only tracks left belonged to our team. I hope I've made my point clear. If not, I'll be more direct. Someone had tried to hide their presence but had made a mistake. Did you catch it yet? Let me help a little. If a man had been traveling up the trail where his tracks had been visible for miles, why would they suddenly vanish 30 yards from the cliff's edge, the same cliff he supposedly jumped from? There was no other path to reach the edge. We checked every direction to be sure. We had a lot of questions but no answers. I looked at Jack and asked what this meant. His response wasn't very helpful. I'm not really sure, but I have a hard time believing that guy jumped all the way from there. We decided to keep this information to ourselves for the time being. We didn't want to upset his family with some wild theory. Even now, I can't say for certain what happened to that young man. If I hadn't noticed the partial heel print and the missing tracks, I wouldn't have thought twice. While I do have my theories, I'll keep them to myself for now. You'd probably think I was crazy. I'll let you all discuss your ideas. I'm curious to see what you come up with. But I warn you, if anyone starts talking about aliens or anything paranormal, we'll laugh it off. They say the most logical explanation is usually the correct one. So, what seems most logical to you?